berarti ada uang belum? You had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it.
This was just scattering money around to build gazebos and fake lakes. The one you bought, you can't build.
If you try to open up the treaty, you can lose everything.
And don't try to paper over what's happening in people's lives.
It's still time for a change.
We had to take over the mess that you left us.
It's not economically disastrous. It's a smart economic thing to do.
And an agreement between Quebec and Canada was always impossible.
It's very unclear, Mr.
No,
don't use gobbledygook.
Live from Gatineau, Quebec, this is the 2021 Federal Leaders Debate. We're coming to you from the Grand Hall in the Canadian Museum of History on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, a place for Canadians to reflect on the country's past. But tonight, we are looking ahead to the future. Good evening, I'm Shachi Curl. I'm the president of the Angus Reid Institute, and tonight I will be your moderator. Let's welcome the party leaders. Justin Trudeau for the Liberal Party, Erin O'Toole for the Conservative Party, Yves-François Blanchet of the Bloc Québécois,
A pleasure.
Jagmeet Singh of the NDP, and Annamie Paul for the Greens. Welcome, leaders.
Good evening.
Great to be here.
Tonight's event is being produced for the Leaders Debates Commission by a media partnership including APTN News, CBC News, CTV News, and Global News. The debate is also offered in 10 other languages, including Cree, Inuktitut, Dene, as well as described video and ASL. 20,000 Canadians have weighed in telling us what they want to hear from the leaders, and 5 themes have emerged: leadership and accountability, climate change, reconciliation, affordability, and COVID recovery. Tonight, 4 undecided voters and journalists, maybe the journalists are undecided as well, will be putting their questions directly to the leaders. And you leaders, you've agreed to tonight's rules and format. So before we begin, please answer the questions you're asked. Do not interrupt each other. I don't want to cut you off, but I will if I have to, okay? All right, let's get started. You will each get a different question, and you have 45 seconds to answer. You all have a countdown clock. The theme is leadership and accountability. Your speaking order has been determined by draw. And Mr. Singh, you are first. Hi, Mr. Singh.
Hi there.
Mr. Singh, you are popular and you inspire many Canadians, but your platform is full of big promises. And when it comes to how you'll pay for it all, there's not a lot of details. Given this, how can Canadians know that you are really ready to lead?
I really appreciate the question, and I want to say good evening to everyone tuning in. There is a serious question that people are asking themselves in this election. They're wondering who's going to pay the price of this pandemic and the recovery. And we do have bold plans about how we can invest in people. But we are the only party with a credible plan that will not put the burden on people, that will not cut the help that they need, unlike Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole, who voted against making the ultra-rich pay their fair share. We believe that billionaires should pay their fair share. We should end the loopholes and the offshore tax havens that mean billions of dollars are lost, that we are not able to invest in people. We want to put the burden on those that are at the very, very top so we can invest in the solutions that people need, tackling the climate crisis, investing in housing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Singh. Next to you, Mr. Trudeau. Because you wanted a new mandate, you plunged the country into an election even as the pandemic spurs thousands of new cases. But over the last 18 months, opposition parties have largely stood with you, putting the nation above politics. Why aren't you doing the same? How can you justify an election at this time?
Thank you, Ms. Curl. I think, first of all, I want to thank Canadians for being here tonight, making an important choice, and also, quite frankly, for everything you've done over the past number of months to help get ourselves and our neighbours through this. Tonight, over the next couple of hours, you're going to hear some very, very different, very strong ideas that are radically different about how we're going to move forward through this pandemic, to end it, how we're going to build back better. Those decisions are going to be taken by your government now, in the coming weeks, this fall, not a year from now, not 2 years from now.
Could it not
And
have
I know
waited a
you
few
want
months,
to go-
Mr.
I
Trudeau?
know you want to go harder and faster on vaccinations. I know you want to go harder and faster on climate change, and you get to choose exactly that in this election.
All right, that's time. Thank you. Mr. Blanchet, to you. You deny that Quebec has problems with racism, yet you defend legislation such as Bills 96 and 21, which marginalize religious minorities, Anglophones, and allophones. Quebec is recognized as a distinct society, but for those outside the province, please help them understand why your party also supports these discriminatory laws.
The question seems to imply the answer you want. Those laws are not about discrimination. They are about the values of Quebec.
And yet religious minorities, sir, cannot progress if they wear their religious gear.
Quebec is not recognized as a distinct society. It's been recognized as a nation on June 16th by the Parliament. 281 votes said that Quebec is a nation, and everybody here seems to agree with that. No more distinct society, which never had any meaning anyway. Meaning, not meeting.
So again, why the discriminatory laws and your support for it, sir?
You may repeat as many times as you want that those are discriminatory laws. We are saying that those are legitimate laws that apply on Quebec territory, and there seems to be people around here who will share this point of view, which is a gain by itself for Quebec.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Ms. Paul, to you. For millions of voters, this is the climate change election. But at this critical time, you've been bogged down in internal strife. If your own party doesn't fully support you, how can Canadians trust you to lead through one of the most defining issues of our times?
It's an excellent question, and it's an honor to be here tonight on the unceded territories of the Algonquin peoples. It has been a very difficult period, and do I wish that our party had been further ahead, particularly at this moment? Absolutely. Do I believe that we have wonderful candidates running all over the country that you should consider voting for? Absolutely. Being who I am and in this position has been incredibly hard. Being here tonight was not an obvious thing. I've had to crawl over a lot of broken glass to get here. I'm proud to be here. I'm proud to be the first of my kind. And because I am the first of my kind, I know that I won't be the last.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. And to you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. that will be in charge of a
Conservative Party. And we have a plan to get the country back on its feet after a difficult 18 months in this crisis. I'm a pro-choice ally to the LGBTQ community. That comes from my service in the military, where I served alongside people from all backgrounds, all orientations, putting the country first. And our platform, including a detailed plan on climate change, is about making sure we secure the future. Jobs, accountability, national leadership on mental health.
So is it you, sir, or your caucus that's driving the bus?
I am driving the bus to make sure we get this country back on track. And I'm here to defend the rights of all Canadians, women, members of the LGBTQ community, Indigenous Canadians. I want to make sure we all secure a future together.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. All right, leaders, thank you. It is now time for our first face-to-face debate. Mr. Trudeau, Ms. Paul, you're up. Starting with Mr. Trudeau, based on this question. You call yourself a feminist, but on your watch, sexual misconduct in Canada's armed forces continues to run rampant. Tell me, why are you allowing these unacceptable conditions to continue?
I think we recognize that there are systems and institutions that need to change across the country, and that's why from the very beginning, we stepped up with policies, new policies, stronger policies and processes to support every survivor, everyone who comes forward, because nobody deserves to work in a workplace where they are being discriminated against, where they are being harassed or hassled. We have been unequivocal about that. My leadership has been unequivocal about that. Yes, these problems continue in workplaces across the country, particularly in the military. That's unacceptable, which is why we've taken even stronger measures. It's unsatisfactory to have to say, we're relying on process in this. We want to just be able to have easy answers.
Ms.
But this
Paul,
is
what's
not
your
an
response
issue
to that?
with easy answers. You have to fall back on process.
I have said before, and I'll say again tonight, that I do not believe that Mr. Trudeau is a real feminist. A feminist doesn't continue to push strong women out of his party when they are just seeking to serve. And I will say their names tonight and thank them. Thank you, Jane Philpott. Thank you, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Thank you, Selena Cesar Chavanez. And I'm here tonight thanks to the work that you have done. I believe that if there were more women on this platform tonight and in previous years, that we, in fact, would have better laws in our military. We would have childcare at this point. We would have many of the things that we need. I am the only woman, other than Elizabeth May, to be on this platform in the last 18 years. The Liberal Party has never had a woman lead it. I think it's time for the party to examine its priorities.
I think, Ms. Hall, you'll perhaps understand that I won't take lessons on caucus management from you.
And
I think what I will keep focused on is making sure that our first woman finance minister has moved forward on
all right, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, I'm sorry, that's time. We have to move on.
Cabinet.
Mr. Blanchet, Mr. O'Toole, and Mr. Singh, this next topic is for you to debate. Canada's transition to a green economy depends on pipelines. At a time when Ontario and Quebec face uncertain energy supply over Line 5, this country cannot extract nor distribute oil domestically. Our theme is leadership. Tell me, which one of you is best to lead on these complex issues? Mr. Blanchet, per the draw, you begin.
I'm not very much interested in leading Canada. However, I am very much interested in making sure that Quebec is entitled to its own vision for the future. You know, in Quebec, we do not have energy issues that much because we are lucky. We are lucky. It's a piece of luck that we can produce green energy in a large amount. But the whole planet cannot afford this idea, this very Canadian idea, this very conservative idea, and as far as I know, this very liberal idea that we have to produce more oil, export more oil, believing that the money from it will reduce gas emission, which won't happen.
All Canadian families deserve an economic recovery, including families in Western Canada that feel left out after 6 years of Mr. Trudeau. When it comes to leadership, our natural resources sector is a leader in environmental social governance. Anytime Canadian resources are removed from the global supply chain, you know who fills that gap? Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia. All of these organizations and companies are getting their emissions down. Let's get emissions down and Canadian resources to market so that we can have jobs opportunity and fight climate change.
Mr. Singh.
When it comes to leadership on the fighting this essential crisis, one of the biggest crises we're up against, we've got a difficult choice for Canadians. You've got on one side someone who doesn't believe there's a crisis, and then on the other you got Mr. Trudeau who doesn't act like there's a crisis. And what it's going to take is real leadership, because the solutions are there. We can invest in green energy, clean energy. We can invest in renewable energy.
Doesn't give up on tens of thousands of workers across the country.
We'll never give up on workers. We're
workers that are working hard for their families, so we can get our resources to market.
Okay, one at a time, gentlemen. Mr. O'Toole, then back to you, Mr. Singh. Mr. O'Toole, then Mr. Singh.
I want to see Canadians get back to work in all sectors and in all regions. And I'm proud of what we produce in our country, whether it's our resources or the resources in the heads of our young people.
But
we need to get emissions down,
Mr. O'Toole,
and get our energy to market.
These workers need a plan that's going to create jobs for the future. And that's a responsibility of government. We've seen 6 years of Mr. Trudeau, and workers can't afford another 4 years. What we need to do is invest in a diversified economy, clean energy. We need to electrify transportation. We need to invest in retrofitting homes and buildings. We need to create good jobs for workers
plan
now.
But we need an economic recovery in all sectors
that have failed workers.
Last word to you, Mr. Blanchet. Last word to you, sir.
Leadership is not only saying the words, it's proposing solutions, admitting a problem, which they're not doing.
All right, thank you. My next question is for all of you. We've had some encouraging news out of Kabul overnight with the escape of 43 Canadians. That said, thousands of people who helped Canada during Canada's mission in Afghanistan have been left behind in their hour of need, and it is unknown if we will ever get them all out. To each of you, what would you have done differently? Mr. O'Toole, per the draw, you begin.
Canada should never leave behind people that are at risk because they helped us. When Afghanistan was falling, there were 1,200 Canadians and hundreds more translators and others waiting for help from Canada. What did Mr. Trudeau do? You called an election, sir. You put your own political interests ahead of the well-being of thousands of people. Leadership is about putting others first, not yourself. Mr. Trudeau, you should not have called this election. You should have gotten the job done in Afghanistan.
Mr. O'Toole,
Hold on. This is not open debate, leaders. This is a situation where we're asking a question to each of you. No problem, Mr. Trudeau. I'm trying to keep track myself.
I would like him, Ms. Curl, because he called an election in the fourth wave of a pandemic with fires in British Columbia and with unfinished business in Afghanistan,
All
Mr.
right,
Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. I'm going to give the opportunity next per the draw to Mr. Singh. You guys will have tons of time to debate, so hang tight. Mr. Singh.
Sadly, what's happened in Afghanistan is a tragedy that was something we knew about. We knew about the withdrawal date. We knew from President Biden what that date would be. And sadly, I agree with Mr. O'Toole on this one point that it was a bad decision to call an election while this crisis was going on, particularly because we've got allies on the ground that put their lives at risk to support our Canadian forces who are now looking at peril for their lives and may never get out of Afghanistan. We know the impact on women and girls in Afghanistan. It's heartbreaking, and it could have been avoided. Veterans had told Mr. Trudeau and his government for a long time that the current approach was not working. Those calls were not heeded, and as a result, we're in this really horrible situation.
Thank you,
it could have
Mr.
been avoided.
Singh. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. Blanchet.
First, good news. I seem to understand from what I read a few hours ago that Kabul airport is now being open for some people to get out of the country, which is very good news. This should have been worked a long, long time ago. I agree with Mr. O'Toole that Mr. Trudeau should have put those people's interest before his own. However, the problem is that Canada has failed many times to create some strong partnerships with other countries in order to be stronger facing a situation like Afghanistan now, because by itself, we must admit, Canada is not a world power.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Mr. Trudeau, I invite you to respond now.
Thank you, Ms. Curl. It's unfortunate to hear the members, the leaders on this stage talking down the incredible work that our Canadian Armed Forces, that our diplomats, that our consular officials did from the beginning of the summer to ensure that as of the very beginning of August, well before this election, we were getting flights out of Afghanistan. We got 3,700 people out of Afghanistan. And over the past weeks, we've been working with the Qataris, for example, on exactly that good news that we've seen of more people, more Canadians getting out of Afghanistan. We work closely with our allies because we know Canadians sacrificed in Afghanistan for a better future. We need to stand by the people who helped us, who helped themselves, and we will with even more people coming to Canada in the coming months.
All right, Mr. Trudeau. Ms. Paul.
As a former diplomat and with a husband who provided advice on the peace negotiations in Afghanistan, we were hearing the stories all the time in the months leading up that this was foreseeable. And so it seems like we got better information on our smartphones than Mr. Trudeau got from our entire intelligence service based on what he's saying. The thing is that when people count on you, when you make a promise to them, then you do it so that people can count on Canada's word. When someone is your partner, you go with them, you go for them, or you don't amount to much. And so leaving behind people in Afghanistan, walking up to Rideau Hall and calling an election under these circumstances was not the right thing to do. And to borrow a line from Mr. Singh from 2019, Mr. Trudeau could just say, hey, man, I messed up.
All right, Ms. Paul, thank you very much. Thank you all. And now it is our time for a first attempt at open debate. Jumping off of this question, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been in Chinese prisons for 1,004 days. The next prime minister has key decisions to make about our already tense relationship with China, such as telecommunications security and foreign investment. Some say this all comes down to a trade-off between Canada's economic growth and recognition of human rights. I'd like to know where you all stand. I'm sure you want to exchange on that. Mr. Singh, per the draw, you begin. Leaders, you may jump in.
Thank you very much. We know that we can't imagine what it is for Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig to be going through 1,000+ days in a prison without access to human rights. I can't imagine what their friends and their families are going through right now. All I know is we have to do everything possible to secure the release of these 2 Canadians. We need to work with our allies, apply pressure, and make sure that we return these Canadians home. That's what we've got to do.
And that's exactly what we've been doing. Over the past 3 years, we have worked with international allies to put pressure on China in every single one of their meetings. We've worked closely with the United States. We, at the G7 a few weeks ago, worked with the international community to make sure we're moving forward on challenging China where necessary in human rights, competing with them economically where we need to, and holding them to account on the rule of law as a global community. And Canada's voice has been very strong on that.
Canada's voice has been absent, Mr. Trudeau. We have not worked with our allies on Huawei. We have not stood up for the 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. We've not fought for the 2 Michaels and put pressure on the communist regime. We have not stood up for human rights. Sir, you did not show up for a vote declaring a genocide towards the Uyghur people. You didn't show up. Canada is the country that was leading the fight against apartheid. We created the UN Human Rights Code. We should be leaders for our values, sir. And you've let the Michaels down, and we have to get serious with China.
If you want to let the Michaels and get the Michaels home, you do not simply lob tomatoes across the Pacific. That is what Mr. Harper tried for a number of years and didn't get anywhere. You need to engage in a sophisticated way with our allies every step of the way.
You have to take the same position on Huawei,
and that's exactly what we have done every step of the time.
Mr. O'Toole.
Cyber security, Mr. Trudeau. We are out of step, and our allies are wondering where Canada's gone. You started as Prime Minister saying you admired China.
If I could...
I'm coming to you, Ms. Paul. Just a second. I want to get to Mr. Singh, and then to you, Ms. Paul.
I appreciate, thank you very much, the opportunity. I want to also we're talking about leadership and accountability. And in this pandemic, one of the moments I think of leadership that has been a failure is the fact that when we talk about leadership, it means finding solutions. And in our long-term care homes here in Canada, we saw the worst conditions in
Mr. Singh, we're going to have time to chat with that later. The topic is China, human rights and economic growth. To you, Ms. Paul.
Yes, and this is an area where certainly lines are being redrawn all across the world. And the main thing that Canada is going to have going forward in terms of currency is its word. When we make a promise, we have to keep those promises. That's how, when we need help, we get it. You know, my mom grew up on a farm in a small community, and she learned very young and taught us that you have to give your word to your neighbors, and they have to be able to count on it so that when you need help, they're there for you. And so when we don't show up, when we're asked for vaccines from COVAX, and then we take vaccines from COVAX, when the Uyghur ask us for help to declare a genocide and we don't do that, when we don't show up on the climate by setting targets that are ambitious, but at the same time in line with our international partners and do our fair share, then our word doesn't count for much, and then it makes it very hard for us to help people like the Michaels when they need us the most.
Mr. Blanchet, did you want to get in on
Throwing
this?
tomatoes might not be the solution, but I would submit humbly that doing nothing might not be the solution either. The Mr. Trudeau's record on human rights is not perfect. We might name the 2 Michaels, we might name Uyghur in Xinjiang, we might name Taiwan, Hong Kong, we might name Catalonia and Mr. Fildebrandt, we might name the worst of all,
Mr. Blanchet.
Raif Badawi being still held in Saudi Arabia because Canada wants to sell weapons and military supply to Saudi Arabia, which is unacceptable. The Parliament voted.
Okay, gentlemen, one at a time.
2 seconds. The Parliament voted unanimously to give citizenship to Raif Badawi. Nothing has been done afterward.
All right. Whoa, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh.
Mr. Blanchet is correct. Canada is needed back on the world stage. We may be smaller than China with respect to population and economy, but we are a giant when it comes to our commitments to human rights, to dignity, and to the rule of law. And we have to start working with our allies to take a more serious approach for human rights standing up for our workers on fair trade, and making sure that our voice is a principled one on the world stage again.
The problem with Mr. O'Toole and his principles is he says all the right-sounding things, and he's working on reassuring everyone that he's right there as a strong leader. But he can't convince his candidates to get vaccinated. He can't convince his MPs to
All
follow
right,
his
let's keep the theme.
pro-choice.
Mr. Singh, you wanted to get in. I'm giving the last word. I'm giving the last word to Mr. Singh. Mr. Trudeau, please. To you, Mr. Singh.
Leadership means standing up. It means standing up for the Uyghur in China. It means standing up to defend people around the world. It also means showing leadership when it comes to fighting the climate crisis. We've got the worst record under Mr. Trudeau in the G7. So that's not leadership, certainly not.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, leaders. We are now moving on to our next theme, which is climate change. All right, this time we're starting with a question from Trevor McMullen. He is a high school teacher in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. He's standing by. Trevor, what's your question?
Hey, good evening. As leader, what immediate actions would you take to make green technology more accessible and affordable so that everyday Canadians don't have to bear the financial burden of being environmentally ethical?
All right. Thank you, Trevor. Leaders, you've heard Trevor's question. Ms. Paul, I apologize. Ms. Paul, you're going first.
Thank you so much for that question. And Trevor, that's exactly where your head should be at. That's where all of our heads should be at. How can we use this opportunity to seize the moment to create a green economy? How can we incentivize every single person in Canada, every company, and every enterprise to adopt green technologies? How can we become a global leader? And so, absolutely, if you look at our platform, you will see that we propose incentives all the way from buying electric cars, new and used, to retrofitting homes, to all of these items that will help make life easier for you and help for you to do your part. But this is a national and international issue. We need national leadership on it, and we need it across party lines.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Singh.
Thank you. Thank you, Trevor. I really appreciate the question. And I'm sure you speak to a lot of young people as a teacher and are seeing the fear in their eyes, the worry and the desperation that young people have because they don't know what type of future they're going to inherit. And they're worried about the impacts of the climate crisis because it's hurting us now, and it's only going to get worse if we don't do anything about it. And to invest in that future, we need to make choices. And right now, we look at the choices Mr. Trudeau has made over the past 6 years. He has promised to end fossil fuel subsidies, but instead of ending them, he has increased them to $900 million per year. That is money we could spend on investing in clean technology, in making it easier for people to access that technology and to do our part to fight the climate crisis. So it's a matter of choices. We can't afford another 4 years of Mr. Trudeau's choices.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. To you, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you for the question, Trevor. I was raised by two strong women who were teachers, and they told me to be straight up. This is an area where the Conservatives, we had to win back some trust. We hadn't met the expectations of Canadians on climate change. It's an important issue for me as a father of a high schooler, and we talk about it all the time. That's why in April, long before the election, I put out a substantial package pricing carbon to meet our Paris targets. And what's interesting, our low carbon savings account will allow people to actually make green choices to lower their carbon footprint. This approach is innovative because it would allow all Canadians to know what their carbon footprint is and make those innovative investments to lower it. I think we all have a role to play, and our plan is detailed and we'll deliver on it.
Mr. Blanchet.
Thank you to be with us, sir. I hope you appreciate a little bit blunt answers. First, you put a ceiling on any production of oil and gas. You take all the money that the federal government is placing into that industry, even more by the Liberals than the Conservatives before, and you put that into green energy. And you take the money for Trans Mountain and you give it to Alberta for Alberta to initiate its own transition toward a greener economy. This is the way to do things, because if we don't do that and keep dreaming about reducing gas emission while increasing production, we will never get there.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you, Trevor, for your question. And from one teacher to another, I know that you need to ground your decisions and what you share with your students in science. And all these leaders on here have various claims about what their climate change plan is going to do. Unfortunately, if you look at what the experts and the climate scientists and the economists have said, we're the ones with the strongest plan to fight climate change. And how to answer your question specifically, how to make it more affordable for Canadians? Well, the first thing we did on that was bring in a national price on pollution that incentivizes businesses to go cleaner at the same time as it puts more money in families' pockets. We are going to put a cap on oil sands and oil and gas emissions and decline it until net zero and create those opportunities and investments that are going to make it more affordable for you and your students for many years to come.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Thank you, Trevor. Have a good evening. I'm turning it back to the leaders. It is time for more debate. The draw has Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole facing off. Your topic is climate change. Even today, 1 in 4 Canadians don't believe that climate change is caused by human activity. How can we achieve real progress when so many people are still debating the fundamentals? Mr. O'Toole, you begin.
Climate change is a real threat, not only to Canada and to the world. That's why we have to take a serious plan to tackle it. That's why, as I said, we put our plan out in April, because we had to restore some trust on this issue to make sure we can show Canadians we can get emissions down and get the economy working again. That is key. We have a plan to meet our Paris targets, but minimize the impact on jobs and investment. We're also going to make major investments in electric vehicles, in the hydrogen economy, small modular reactors. There is so much we can do to get our emissions down, but grow a strong economy, because without a strong economy, we can't tackle climate change. We can't tackle the issues of today.
The reality that Mr. O'Toole has never understood is you can't have a strong economy unless you tackle climate change. And you ask about how we're going to convince the quarter of Canadians who still don't think climate change is real. Well, Mr. O'Toole can't even convince his party that climate change is real, because they voted against that. And that's perhaps why his plan is so weak. His plan is to go back to the Harper targets, to the Harper approach on fighting climate change, which doesn't work. His costed platform, which he just put out last night, cuts $2 billion from climate investments and from things. And for our friends in BC,
you have never made a target,
has proposed to restore
let him respond, Mr. Trudeau.
Pipeline.
Mr. Trudeau, let Mr. O'Toole respond to you, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Ms. Curl.
The tanker ban.
Mr. Trudeau always forgets one fact. He has never made a target for climate change. He has great ambition. That's part of the reason we're in an election and a pandemic, is his ambition. He doesn't have achievement. Well, he never meets his targets. So we have a plan
in 2030,
that we will meet
it's
the targets
quite difficult
and
to
get
meet
our
a target
country
that's 9 years away, except for the fact that right now we are on track.
Gentlemen, we have to wrap this segment.
Over
all right,
target.
we are moving on.
We are
moving on, leaders. Next up is Mr. Singh, Mr. Blanchette, and Ms. Paul. I'd like each of you to describe how you'll implement a national approach that best recognizes the significant regional differences involved in fighting climate change. You begin, Mr. Singh. You may jump in one at a time, please.
Of course.
Well, here's the thing. We just heard Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau argue about who's worse. And honestly, it's a tough question to answer. Let me tell you, you're not stuck with these two. Better is possible. We can invest in a clean economy. We can end fossil fuel subsidies. We can make sure we're creating clean transportation, and we can invest in provinces and territories to make sure they have the resources necessary to fight the climate crisis. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. I'm going to be a dad soon, and I want to make sure my child grows up into a future that has the same opportunities that I had, that has clean air, clean water, a clean place to live. I want to make sure that that's
as far as I understand it, it is not a national or even less a regional issue. It is a planetary issue. And it has to be tackled by everybody at once. But I would be glad to give some of my precious time to Mr. O'Toole, because a week ago, a little more than that, he said in French that he did not want anymore to have a pipeline to go through Quebec. That was quite a statement. He said that in French, no more pipeline through Quebec. I want to hear that in English tonight. Please, please.
Well, Mr.
Hold on. This segment is...
I'll take time.
Quite frankly,
we're not going to let that happen.
This on the climate, this sort of approach is going to get us nowhere, and I mean but nowhere. It is, and the question was an excellent one. This is a global issue. This is a national issue. This is a nonpartisan issue, and we have got to be able to come together across party lines. I said that I was available for a debate just on the climate because it's that important, but we've invited many times all of the parties to join us in a joint cabinet, a cross-party cabinet, to deal with this the way that we dealt with the pandemic, together. People were so inspired to see these leaders come together in the early days of the pandemic. We have got to bring that same approach here. Let's come together because that's what's needed.
Thank you very much. I absolutely agree. We do need to come together. I can lay out what we shouldn't do and what we need to do. What we shouldn't do is what Mr. Trudeau did. Set targets and miss them. We shouldn't promise to end fossil fuel subsidies and then increase them. We shouldn't put a price on pollution and then exempt the biggest polluters. What we need to do is end those fossil fuel subsidies, invest in provinces and territories with infrastructure that's going to help us
with the greatest of respect to Mr.
Hold on, Mr. Singh.
With the greatest of respect to
let Ms. Paul respond.
With the greatest of respect to Mr. Singh, we have been making this invitation for years, and it has never been accepted by the NDP or any other party.
All right,
it's
we
great
have
to hear that
we
they
have to
agree,
wrap
but
this section now, leaders. It is time for me, with great pleasure, to welcome Mercedes Stephenson of Global News. She is joining us now, and she's going to be asking each of you a direct question on climate change. This round starts with Mr. Trudeau. Hi, Mercedes.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Hello, candidates. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to ask you about a question that is on a lot of Canadians' minds, the question of climate change. Mr. Trudeau, starting with you. On your watch, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions have gone up every year since 2016, giving this country the worst emissions reduction record in the G7. According to the most recent data from your government, Canada's emissions in 2019 were just as high as they were 15 years ago. Environmentalists say that your performance is insufficient. If you're so serious about climate change, why are Canada's emissions still going up?
We inherited a government from conservatives that did not believe in the fight against climate change, and we had a lot of catching up to do. But what we were able to do in 6 years is bring a national price on pollution, ban single-use plastics, move forward in protecting more of our coasts and oceans and rivers than any government in history. And we are right now on track to exceeding those 2030 targets set at the beginning at Paris, down to 36%. And we've gone even further with that, with a concrete plan that the experts have said is the only one that can achieve a 40% reduction.
Which they say you're unlikely to meet.
That is what we're dealing with.
Okay, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Blanchet.
Madame.
Your party often criticizes the oil and gas industry in Canada's western provinces. You've said that you would block pipelines trying to go through Quebec. While you were the environment minister, though, you allowed oil exploration and carbon-intensive projects without environmental assessment. So why the double standard, and what do you say to Canadians who feel that you're blocking their prosperity?
There were three issues that have been raised since I've been into this election. First one is having reversed the 9B line of Enbridge, which had been reversed a few years sooner without any evaluation or anything. Second one is a project in Baie des Chaleurs, which already had been submitted to an evaluation, an environmental evaluation. And the other one was to have an environmental, I will come to that, evaluation after the exploration. This is all a build-up made by the previously environmentalist Stephen Guilbeault from the Parti Libéral, which the Prime Minister did not even know about when he attacked me with it. My record is also having signed the carbon market with California, which is still considered the best way to tackle the gas emission through incentives and tariffs around, I wouldn't say the world,
All right,
at least North America.
That is time. Mercedes, your next question.
Mr. O'Toole, you're next. Under your plan, Canada would abandon its current climate target. Instead, you would settle for a weaker one. In fact, it's one set 6 years ago by Stephen Harper. World leaders are meeting this fall to ratchet up their commitments on climate change on the global stage, yet you would walk ours back. You've said that climate change is real and you've endorsed carbon pricing, but your target is the lowest of all of the major parties who are here tonight. Why should Canadians settle for your plan and a plan that would take our targets back in time?
Because Canadians deserve to have a plan and leadership to make the targets. Mr. Trudeau went to Paris. The targets I'm talking about making are the ones he signed on to, and then for 6 years did not make them. He likes to blame everyone else but himself for action. So what we did, because as I said, Mercedes, we have to build trust on this issue, we went out and worked with the top consultancy in the country to come up with a plan to price carbon, to get our emissions down to meet Paris, but to also get people back to work. After COVID-19, with $500 billion worth of debt put on by Mr. Trudeau, with a cost of living crisis, we also need to have a strong economy to get our emissions down. We will make our emission targets, and I think it's important for Canada to have a plan to meet what it signs on to internationally.
Ms. Paul of the Green Party, obviously environment a big focus in your plan, calls for a 60% reduction in Canada's emissions by the year 2030. Other countries that are making that commitment don't face the same challenges that we do here in Canada. We live in a cold, northern, sprawling country, and our economy still relies on resource extraction, much of which you've said you would shut down completely in your platform. How would you offset the economic harm that would result from meeting such an aggressive target?
Thanks for the question. And first, let me say that when I think about our future and I think about the future of energy, Canada will remain an energy superpower, but we will be a renewable energy superpower. And I think about my brother who was a roughneck out on the oil patch until the bust during the pandemic. And I think about his future, and I know that we have got to diversify our economy. But I tell the people of Canada today that what happens next is really up to you. We can keep moving towards a mirage, and that is what these promises are, a mirage that's just out there in the distance that we never arrive at. Or you can send people back to Ottawa from every single party who are committed to working together across party lines on the greatest existential challenge of our time and seizing the opportunity of a truly green recovery.
Mr. Singh, you accuse the Trudeau government of being all talk and no action when it comes to climate change, and yet you won't even give Canadians a straight answer on whether or not you would cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. You've had years as NDP leader to develop a climate plan. Your platform has lots of big ideas and big targets, but almost no details on how you would get there. Don't you owe Canadians a clear answer on your climate roadmap, and will you provide one tonight?
Absolutely, and I'm honored to do so. We've got a bold plan that's going to take a lot of courage, that requires lots of investment, because we know how serious this crisis is. And we know what we're up against. Unlike Mr. Trudeau, we're not going to blame previous governments. We know that in power, we have the power to make a change. And if we vote for the same things, we're going to get the same results. So I want Canadians to know you have a choice. We are committed to ending.
What is your plan, sir?
We'll lay some of it out. One of it is to end fossil fuel subsidies, use that to invest in clean energy. We would make sure we prioritize investing in electrified transportation. We would invest in retrofitting homes and buildings to reduce our emissions. There is so much that we can do. We are confident we can do it. But there is a cost if we continue down the same path of conservative or liberals who don't take this seriously. You have a choice.
All right. Thank you. Now it is time for open debate. Mercedes is going to keep you leaders on theme. I'm going to keep you on time and make sure everyone has a chance to be heard. Ms. Paul, we're starting with you. Back to you, Mercedes.
Thank you. Canadians want their government to fight climate change, but they also worry about the cost for their families. And we know there will be a cost to this. Why should Canadians trust your party to see us through this?
There is a global green rush going on now to create the competitive green economy of the future. What the Greens don't want to see is Canada being left behind, because that is exactly what's happening. You know, I'm sure that the last candle maker was the person that had the market cornered on candle making. But if everyone has moved on to LED lights, then you're in trouble. And so what we want to see is us seizing this opportunity. And Mercedes, to your earlier question, if Denmark and Greenland, other cold countries, can end oil exploration, then certainly we can do it. And if 27 countries in the European Union can come together collaboratively to have an ambitious plan for the climate, then surely with leadership, we can do the same here in Canada. I know Canada can do anything that any other country can do.
Absolutely. I
As
think we
said
absolutely
earlier,
can.
If any type of energy is removed from the global market, Canadian energy, it's replaced by a bad actor country that doesn't have carbon reduction programs, it doesn't have human rights, it doesn't have engagement with Indigenous communities. Indigenous partnerships in natural resources is huge. So you said the cost. There are tens of thousands of jobs that deserve an economic recovery just as much as anyone else. There are Indigenous partnerships, economic reconciliation, and a move towards a made in Canada net zero by 2050. So let's be leaders in getting carbon emissions down and being world leaders on how we have natural resources, whether it's energy, timber, rare earth minerals for EVs, then we can be world leaders again.
Let's talk about the cost. The cost of inaction is an entire town of Lytton being wiped out by a climate forest fire. The cost of inaction is forest fires and flooding and heat waves that mean Canadians lose their lives. The cost of not acting means a young woman I met in Hamilton who looked me in the eyes and said, what's the point of me pursuing my education? What's the point of me finding a partner or even starting a family when I don't know what type of future I'll live in, let alone my child? That's the cost of inaction. That's the cost of Mr. Trudeau, who had 6 years to do something about this.
Again,
it's not 2 years. It's not a small mandate. 6 years, and he failed you, and it cost all of us.
Mr. Trudeau.
When we talk about a climate crisis, we have to deal in facts. And one of the facts I need to correct right now that everyone is laid into is we have not missed any of our targets. We are on track to exceeding our targets. And it's important that we are on facts. Secondly, I do have a question for Mr. Singh. We need to talk about science. We need to talk about experts. We agree on that, you and I both. So how is it that the experts that have rated our plan on climate to be an A have rated your plan to be an F?
Experts,
I rate your track record an F, Mr. Trudeau. You've had 6 years.
You don't get to rate. People know.
Well,
politicians,
not just me.
experts. Why did the experts give you an F on your climate plan?
Let's talk about right now. Let me respond to this. Let's talk. You're talking about the future. Let's talk about right now. You had 6 years.
Why did you get
Let me finish. Let me finish.
Climate?
You've got the worst track record in all the G7 after 6 years. How can people trust you?
Why didn't you put forward an ambitious plan?
Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau, then Ms. Paul, then Mr. Blanchet.
I don't accept that, first of all. I don't accept that at all. We've got a bold
hold on,
plan
Ms. Paul.
and a strong plan.
Mr. Singh, thank you very much, Mr. Trudeau.
You get heated about these things.
He cannot explain why his plan is being panned by experts. Now, every politician up here says, we have the best plan. We actually have a record. And what Mercedes' question was, how do we make sure it's affordable? We brought in a price on pollution across the country that puts more money back in the pockets in the provinces where it had to be imposed because conservative politicians fought against it every step of the way.
Ms. Paul,
with the greatest of respect, I think the 5 PhDs in our shadow cabinet who put together our green recovery policy would disagree with you, with the experts. But I do want to say more generally that, again, this is getting us nowhere. We have got to be able to come together across party lines, not only to face the existential crisis that Mr. Singh described, but also to seize the greatest economic opportunity that Canada has seen within our lifetimes. We are being left behind. And if the United States can do it, if the European Union can do it, I know that we can do it. It's about a change in the culture.
All right, thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Blanchet, did you want to get
shows
in?
that I'm quite behind everybody else, and I have 12 seconds left.
Take some
I will
time,
disagree
sir.
with the basic statement. There's possibility to create more wealth to absorb the cost of the changes that we need. We must stop opposing environment and creating wealth. It may go together well. This is the change that we have to do.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mercedes. And now, leaders, we are moving on to our next theme, reconciliation. Now we are going to our first-time voter, Merrick McLeod in Sault Ste. Marie. He's got a question to all the leaders. Merrick, you're 18 years old. You're a first-time voter. What is your question to the leaders? Go ahead, Merrick. The leaders are listening.
Ani Bojo. In the Ojibwe culture, trust and respect is key to any relationship. Oh, shoot.
You got it, Merrick. Keep going.
How can I trust and respect the federal government after 150 plus years of lies and abuse to my people? And as Prime Minister, what will you do to rebuild the trust between First Nations and the federal government?
Thank you, Merrick. Leaders, you've heard the question. How do you respond to Merrick? Mr. Trudeau, you start this round.
Thank you, Merrick, for your question. You're absolutely right. Over the past 150 years, Canada has failed in its relationship with Indigenous peoples. People who we should be working with in shared stewardship of the land, working with in partnership as we draw from the bounty and the beauty of this land to build a better future for all. That is why over the past 6 years, we have stepped up on the path of reconciliation. We have ended boil water advisories in 109 different communities. We have made sure that tens of thousands of young people get to go to school in better classrooms. We continue to move forward on fighting fighting for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and ensuring a true partnership as we move forward in respect.
Mr. Blanchet.
Your question is quite moving. I would say that no one is entitled to tell any nation what to do or what to think, and that every nation has to be recognized as such. Either it is a nation of 300 people, like there is in Quebec, or an 8 million people nation like Quebec is. It calls for a relationship between equals. It calls for a relationship in which nobody tells the other party that they are stronger, bigger, richer, and therefore you will do as you are told, even if we say it politely. And first, you provide clean water to everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Ms. Paul.
Yes, and thank you so much for the question, and I understand the anguish in it as well, because justice delayed is justice denied. And coming from a diaspora myself, where we have been robbed of our culture, of our languages, of our history, I have no idea where my ancestors were born or where they're buried. I completely understand how important this is and how frustrating it is not to have seen the action. I am tired of being up on these stages without Indigenous leadership here to speak for itself. Jody Wilson-Raybould, Mumalak Kalak, I'm thinking of you right now. And when Ms. Kakak said that without action, that the Parliament would be hollow, she was right. So Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, nation-to-nation engagement, that is my commitment.
Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. McLeod, thank you for the question. And the way you phrased it is so important. Reconciliation is about trust and respect and restoring it after a century and a half of a federal government failing. That's why, as opposition leader, my first question when I rose in the House of Commons was on a call to action on reconciliation with respect to Indigenous health. We need to build partnerships. We need to restore trust. And that trust is eroded when you make commitments on safe drinking water on reserve, when you make commitments on the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Report and have no plan to fulfill them. So I want to build partnerships and have Indigenous leaders have governance over the federal government finally delivering on our commitment to Indigenous peoples.
Mr. Singh.
Thank you very much, Merrick. Thank you for your question. How to restore trust? How do you restore trust when Indigenous communities suffer injustice and it continues in an unbroken line to this very day? How do you restore trust when you've got a prime minister that takes a knee one day and then takes Indigenous kids to court the next? And how do you restore trust in a country as wealthy as ours, a G7 nation in the 21st century that still does not provide clean drinking water to every single Indigenous nation? It starts by actually walking the path of reconciliation, not with the empty words, but real action, clean water, nation to nation, and respect.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Singh. Merrick, did the leaders answer your question?
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Miigwech. Messieurs Blanchette and O'Toole, it is your turn to debate now. You've promised more money to search for unmarked graves, but so much more needs to be done to achieve meaningful reconciliation. Mr. Blanchette, you begin. Tell me, how are you better positioned than Mr. O'Toole to restore justice?
I am not better positioned than Mr. O'Toole because I believe that this is a relationship between nations. And your presence a nation, I feel I represent another one, and we are discussing with a lot of other nations. But I will remind everybody that on the last day of the last session, we had a motion adopted unanimously by the Parliament, and this motion was precisely saying what we had been told to carry by the First Nation leaders, and we had it adopted. This might be the way to do it. Many times the Bloc Québécois said, even if we don't agree with everything, that we would share our seats and our voices in the Parliament with the First Nations in order to have them being heard by the whole country.
After the tragic finding of graves in Kamloops, Cowessess, and other former residential school sites, we offered to work in a bipartisan fashion on calls to action 71 to 76. Those are related to former residential school sites. And we need to act faster. I know Mr. Trudeau cares a great deal about reconciliation. I know we all do. But this is an issue where we have to act. We can no longer say that we recognize the calls to action. We need a plan to achieve them. And what I'm proposing is a plan that builds partnerships, that builds governance, that has Indigenous leaders, incredible ones like Jody Wilson-Raybould, to allow us to actually hold ourselves to account. All parties, all future governments. This is the biggest scar in the history of Canada. And we have to tackle it not just with good intentions, but with a good plan to deliver for all Indigenous people.
Mr. Blanchette,
I must
briefly.
say that the Prime Minister has nominated Gouverneur Général, I don't know how to translate that, who speaks Inuktitut, which is great, but does not speak French. Still, he does not agree with the idea of acknowledging, recognizing First Nation languages as official languages in his country.
All right, we will leave that segment there. Ms. Paul, Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau, you're up. Tell me, what is your plan to end the ongoing disproportionate violence against Indigenous women and girls? Ms. Paul.
The first thing is to make space for Indigenous leadership because, we have done all these things and made all these promises. We know what needs to be done. The recommendations are there in the calls for justice and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report, and yet we still don't have the action. And so, as I said before, it should be Jody up here answering that question. It should be Mumala Kakak up here answering that question. We need to make the space for Indigenous leadership to guide this process, and above all, we need to make this a priority. All that is left now is political will.
But that is exactly what we have been doing, Ms. Paul. When we called the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls after years of governments avoiding doing that, we ensured that we brought the truth forward. And then we worked with Indigenous leaders groups, Indigenous women's groups to co-develop the action plan that we are now fully funding so we can get justice for the victims, healing for the families, and put an end to this ongoing national tragedy. It will take a lot of work by all of us, but we are walking this road in partnership because we know it needs to be done and there is much more to do.
But Mr. Trudeau, sadly, and this, I don't take any pleasure in this, the calls to justice are out there and you haven't acted on them. And I meant it when I said you can't take a knee one day if you're going to take Indigenous kids to court the next. That's not leadership.
Mr. Singh,
that's
you
not gonna make
love
things
that
better.
line about taking Indigenous kids to court. It's actually not true. We have committed to compensating those kids who went through that.
Listen,
and what's more than that, this is important, Mr. Singh.
No, you can't say you're not taking them to court when you're taking them to court.
When you talk
there
about
are kids out there that are being fought by you in court.
Leaders, I would actually remind you the question is about violence against Indigenous women and girls. Let me recenter you on that.
I appreciate it because he can't continue to say that. That
Well,
doesn't make any sense.
and Ms. Curl, I will say again, I said this last night in the French debate, this is why we need more diversity in politics. This is why we need people who are most directly impacted by issues to be able to speak for themselves, because we are drifting off into things. We have only dedicated 2 minutes to talking about how we are going to bring true justice to Indigenous women in this country. If we could stick to the topic.
Mr. Trudeau.
Ms. Curl, on this topic, and it was brought up in the earlier one, and we talked about Indigenous women, I want to talk about those kids buried in unmarked graves across the country, because it was a tragedy for all Canadians, one long known by Indigenous peoples. But when I went to Cowessess to speak with Chief Casmus Delorme, we not only grieved those kids, we signed an agreement, a landmark agreement, to keep kids at risk in their communities, to take them out of the provincial system. That is how we move forward. It took years to sign that agreement, but we got it, and we are empowering Indigenous communities
Mr.
to
Trudeau,
care for
we're
their
out
own
of
kids.
time. Mr. Singh, I'm going to give you very brief moment to respond. Briefly, we're over time.
We need to implement all the calls to justice. We need to listen to Indigenous women and girls. We need to make sure that they're safe, and we have the steps that they've laid out that we need to follow.
All right, thank you very much, leaders. Now I'm really pleased to welcome Melissa Ridgen of APTN News. Melissa is going to be asking you each a direct question on our theme of reconciliation. Your first question, hi Melissa, is to Mr. Blanchet. Over to you.
Tanshe, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here with you to ask some questions for our APTN audience. Mr. Blanchet, I'm going to start with you. You know, numerous government reports, including in Quebec, have sounded the alarm that systemic racism exists, from Joyce Echequan dying as she's taunted by hospital staff, to policing, the justice system. What will you do as Black leader to address systemic racism in your own province, in Quebec, and also elsewhere in Canada?
First, never underestimate the weight, the sadness of those dramas. Second, I acknowledge and I recognize the existence of systemic racism in June 2020. And then what happened? It became a political tool against Quebec. It became a tool to say Quebec is this and that and racist and xenophobic and all of that, instead of opening a discussion, trying to find solution, consulting experts, discussing with the First Nations themselves. It became this white society against this other one, white society. We build nothing, so the words became toxic. I'm
What are you
absolutely
going to do?
open to the idea of discussing all of that on a quiet stage without this aggressivity, being aggressive as this debate has become.
All right, Mr. Blanchet, we have to move on. Your next question, Melissa.
This question's for you, Ms. Paul. You know, Canada has more children in government custody right now than at the height of residential schools. New legislation, child welfare legislation, actually takes the onus on and puts it on the First Nations communities to bring their kids back, cleaning up the mess that Canada has created, essentially. And those children are going to have to be brought back to all of those same problems that still exist, that were the grounds for apprehension. What would you do in the House of Commons to make sure that poverty and trauma issues are addressed?
Thank you very much for that question. And absolutely, we mentioned that not that long ago in one of our statements that the residential school system had been replaced by children in care, and that this was just perpetuating the legacy of trauma. It really comes back to what I said before, which is that the Indigenous leadership is there. It is ready to guide all of these processes. We have all of the recommendations we need. What we are missing is political will. What we are missing is those who have been in power for a very long time, making space for new voices and diverse voices. I actually had to pull my jaw up, which just dropped, when I heard what Mr. Blanchet said. I invited Mr. Blanchet to get educated about systemic discrimination. I extend that invitation again. I would be happy to educate him.
It's nice to want to educate
This
me.
is my time, sir.
It is.
Thank you.
So nice time to insult people.
That was not an insult. It was an invitation to educate yourself.
This is Leader Direct Questions.
There
Melissa,
should be some
Mr.
decency in
Blanchet.
this debate. Since I'm many minutes behind everybody else, there should be some
Mr.
decent
Blanchet,
scenes
you have
that
had
we
every
debate.
opportunity to
It's
jump
your
in an open
responsibility,
debate.
not mine, but some things
And
cannot
I am
be said.
fulfilling my responsibility, sir. Melissa, we're going to keep moving on.
Is
Your
it my
next-
turn?
It is your turn.
Well, thank you. Mr. Trudeau, this is for you. You know, your Liberal government has turned Indian affairs into two separate, massive bureaucracies that eat up large portions of funding that will never see it on to reserve. It doesn't leave the bureaucracy. You know, you've promised clean drinking water, but billions of dollars later, that's not happened. Many still do not have clean drinking water. You know, Canadians and Indigenous people are losing patience with the lack of results from all of this spending. So I guess the question is, why would they believe you a third term that they would get results and you'd be accountable for all that spending?
One of the enemies of progressive politics, Melissa, is cynicism. Is discounting the hard work that millions of people have been involved in over the past years. And yes, there's always more to do. Progressives always know there's more to do. But when we came into office, there were 105 long-term boil water advisories. We lifted 109 of them, and for each of the ones that are remaining, we have a project lead, a project team, and an action plan, and we're going to lift those all. There are tens of thousands of kids across this country, Indigenous kids, who've started the school year in new schools or refurbished schools. We have moved forward on settling more agreements and more land claims and more partnerships than any other government over the years. We continue to work in partnership and respect and invest more money in Indigenous communities than any previous government. And no, we're not done yet.
I think the money, I don't think anybody's questioning the money spent. I think that they're questioning the results for the money that's spent. My next question is to you, Mr. Singh. You know, federal forces, including the RCMP and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, have been used throughout Canada's history to prevent First Nations from exercising their treaty rights to fish and to hunt and to defend land and water. This is happening right now on both coasts, including under the NDP party in British Columbia with regards to fishing and logging. So my question would be to you, as Prime Minister, what would you do to ensure Indigenous rights and title are finally respected in this country?
I really appreciate the question. First of all, we need to respect Indigenous treaty land and rights. That's a fundamental step towards walking the path of reconciliation in a real meaningful way. But you mentioned the RCMP, and I got to talk about the really sad reality that there's been violence, heavy-handed violence, against Indigenous communities, against peaceful protesters. And I have long called for reform of policing. When I was in the provincial level, I fought against carting. I've continued to use every platform I have to say, we've got to stop the use of force. We've got to overview it. We've got to change the RCMP's mandate. And that's something we can do at the federal level. That's something that Mr. Trudeau said he would do and yet has yet to do. And it's something I'm committed to making sure happens.
Mr. O'Toole, next question is for you. You know, you voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that would share decision-making power with Indigenous people over what happens on their land. And you also want to criminalize Indigenous dissent that's expressed through blockades or protests. So the question is, if you're Prime Minister, how could Canada build a respectful nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people?
Thank you, Ms. Ridgen. And this goes very similar to Mr. McLeod's question on trust and respect. I want to build those partnerships. And that's why our only concern with the United Nations Declaration was how free and prior informed consent was defined so that it didn't stop partnerships from being formed. I'm really glad to say one of the early leaders behind the UN Declaration, Chief Willie Littlechild, has agreed to serve as a special counsel to me on the implementation of that to make sure that there are partnerships and opportunities. What I want to do as Prime Minister is build that type of nation-to-nation dialogue and partnership so that the next generation has intergenerational wealth and opportunity transfer, not trauma. And building that trust will be core to me. It's why, as I said, my first question was on reconciliation. We have to make progress.
All right, thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Now we move on to open debate. A reminder that Melissa will be here to keep the leaders on theme. I will be here to do my best to keep you on time. And all of you have an opportunity to jump in after Mr. Trudeau begins with a question from Melissa.
Okay, I think if there's one thing that Canadians and Indigenous people can all agree upon, it is that this Indian Act system is not working for anybody. How would you dismantle this broken top-down system, and what would you replace it with that would ensure that Canada still is living up to its constitutional obligations to Indigenous people?
First of all, we are looking forward to dismantling the Indian Act. It is a commitment of ours, but it is not something that Ottawa gets to decide. And what replaces the Indian Act will vary from community to community as we live up to our obligations. And that's why over the years, as we've moved towards self-government, we have accompanied communities, some who want to start with health, some who want to start with education, some who want to start with economic development. Every community, every nation across this country gets to help define what its path is forward. We will be there to listen, to partner, to build a better future every step of the way.
The way to go forward is to listen to leaders. And Mr. Trudeau ignored one that he had in his own cabinet, in Jody Wilson-Raybould. That was a huge lost opportunity. We've been speaking to people with how we can accelerate treaty resolution. There are some treaty negotiations, Ms. Ridgen, that have been going on, as you probably know, for decades. We need to solve it, and we need to work with Indigenous leaders. There's incredible Indigenous leaders in nonprofits, in the private sector, in industry, in academia. We need to use that governance capacity to finalize treaties and build partnerships.
Absolutely.
Because the best way forward is success for Indigenous peoples alongside their neighbors, alongside
Mr. Singh and then Mr. Trudeau. I'm coming to you, Mr. Trudeau.
I'll just jump in on this one point. I think absolutely the solution has to be Indigenous-led. And I think that's the starting point. And for a long time, we've seen that there's been a top-down approach that has to change. It has to be Indigenous people at the table. But I want to talk about the impacts, so just we understand how severe this is, how the Indian Act is creating injustice and perpetuating injustice. I spoke to B, who's a young woman, a young girl who lives in Niskandiga. And she told me in her own voice, she said, I'm a 12-year-old girl and I'm fighting for clean drinking water. How does that make any sense? Those words haunt me to this day. I think about what 12-year-olds do, and they certainly aren't fighting for clean drinking water. That is a legacy. That is the impact of the Indian Act.
I want to go back to what Mr. O'Toole has been saying, because he's very able at saying all the right things, but there are countless examples of him actually not living up to his words. We've seen him on a number of times during this campaign, but on Indigenous issues specifically, he says we need to listen to Indigenous peoples. Well, he proposed that he would raise the flags that are at half-mast for the kids in unmarked graves in residential schools. And he didn't talk to or listen to any Indigenous leaders when he made that decision. And that's something that is important and symbolic, but wouldn't cost a cent. How do we believe that he would be able to actually make the investment necessary?
Hold on. I'm going to give Ms. Paul and Mr. Blanchet a chance to jump in. We haven't heard from them yet. Time permitting, I'll come back to you, Mr. O'Toole.
And I really, again, want to
I asked Mr. Trudeau to move immediately.
Hold on, Ms. Paul.
I really just want to try to recenter our conversation on Indigenous peoples and what we are going to do to fulfill the many unfulfilled promises and commitments that have been made. And I would say, perhaps to pick up on what has been said, that it seems all too often that reconciliation is treated like a buffet. You can opt in for this, pick this plate, but not the other one. And that applies to what we've seen with Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals. You can't, on the one hand, say reconciliation and then go and not allow Mi'kmaq fishers to be able to have a decent, moderate living for all of these years. You can't call reconciliation and then take Indigenous peoples to court. But Mr. Singh, you also can't say reconciliation and then support the NDP government in putting pipelines through Indigenous territories, or support Line 5 after the Anishinaabe made it very clear that they did not support that project.
Ms. Paul, I'm going to allow Mr. Blanchet to get in. He's been signaling he wants to.
Yes.
I will come back to the two of you. Mr. Blanchet.
First Nations and Quebec have something in common. They are binded by a document they never signed. And any relationship between nations should be dealt with freely signed treaties or agreements or something. The Indian Act has to be replaced one nation at a time, if need be, by and with freely signed treaties and agreement. There's no other way. And if I may come back a few seconds on something else. Quebec wants religion out of the state affairs because religion never protected equality for women and never will.
We are over time. I'm going to give you both a chance to briefly respond. Mr. O'Toole, then Mr. Singh. Briefly, please.
I am proud of this country, and I think if you love your country, you can dig deep to make it better. So as Prime Minister on the National Day of Reconciliation on September 30th, I will raise the flag with a commitment to move forward on calls to action. Mr. Trudeau promises things, doesn't deliver, and then when people protested him, he mocked them. That is not reconciliation. So you can be proud of your country as you strive for it to get better.
Thank you, Mr.
Sir.
O'Toole. Mr. Singh, briefly.
I think that Mr. Trudeau may care. I think he cares. But the reality is that he's often done a lot of things for show and hasn't backed those up with real action. And the harm is that Indigenous people continue to suffer. And that's what I want to stop. I want to stop the suffering and lift up Indigenous people by being
5
allies.
seconds, Mr. Trudeau, then we got to go. Mr. Trudeau, 5 seconds.
Unfortunately, the cynicism that Mr. Singh is showing on saying we did nothing is harming reconciliation and the path we're moving forward. We have lots more to do, and we are doing it.
All right, leaders, thank you. Thank you, Melissa.
Merci, merci.
Merci.
And now it is time for our fourth theme for the night, affordability. It's time now to bring in Janet Falla. She is a senior working part-time in Burlington, Ontario. Good evening, Janet. Please tell us what your question is to the leaders.
My question is this: at my age, I never imagined that I would have to keep on working, but I have to afford to live where I do. So I'd like to know, when they become Prime Minister, what will they do to help us seniors survive?
Thank you, Janet. Leaders, you've heard Janet's question. We're starting with you, Mr. Blanchet.
Merci, Madame. For many months now, the Bloc Québécois has demanded for the government to increase the amount of money being provided on a monthly basis to our elders. It's nowhere in the Conservatives' program, and in the Liberals' program, it starts at 75, nothing below 75 for this pension. I'm not sure about the word in English. It has to be done. Those people are those who suffered the most from the pandemic. Their power to buy things was reduced. The fact that they were alone more than never before was made worse. And the stress, the anxiety they lived with is terrible. We want something to be done, and it has to start with a monthly check, seriously increased.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Ms. Valla, for the question. This is a crisis facing our country, affordability, and it's hitting our seniors the hardest. That's why in Canada's recovery plan, our plan to give you a break, we're going to double the Canada Workers' Benefit. There are many seniors like you having to work to keep up with the cost of living. We're going to double that for you to give you a break. We're going to get bills down for internet, for cellular phone. We're going to get grocery bills down. That is our plan and our commitment. And in December, we're going to give you a break with the GST holiday and help bricks and mortar stores in the process. Mr. Trudeau is borrowing every day $424 million, and he's causing an inflation crisis. We have to secure our future, and that's our commitment to you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Trudeau.
Ms. Fallish, thank you so much for your question. We know that seniors have been deeply affected by this pandemic, the isolation, the extra costs, which is why we stepped up with a one-time support so you could help get through this pandemic. But we need longer-term supports. One of the first things we did was increase the guaranteed income supplement for our most vulnerable single seniors when we first got elected. We're doing that again in our proposal in this election. We're also moving forward with increasing the OAS for all seniors over 75 because we recognize that the costs continue to increase as you get older and continue to want to live at home. We're giving you more supports so you can stay at home safely and make those renovations. Importantly, we will continue to have your backs as we have through this pandemic and into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Singh.
I want to thank you so much for your question. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you didn't think you would have to keep on working. And I don't think our seniors should have to work. If seniors want to contribute by working, that's absolutely their right. But you shouldn't have had to work. And in a country as rich as ours, we should make sure our seniors are able to retire with dignity. that you've got the supports necessary to live a life of dignity. So what we're proposing to do is put in place a guaranteed income for seniors so they can live with dignity and not have to worry about paying the bills. That's a starting point. What we've seen so far is that Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole both are going to either cut the help that you receive or put the burden back on people like you. We believe that the ultra-rich should pay their fair share for once and invest in you, invest in families, invest in people.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Ms. Paul.
Thank you very, very much for the question. And as someone who comes from a family where my grandma and grandfather had to work until actually they were kicked out of working because they needed to keep working to afford the basics, I completely understand what you're saying. And this is an opportunity for us to learn the lessons from this pandemic and to really get to the heart of things and to stop talking about the symptoms, but get to the root causes. We need to have, absolutely, and it's so wonderful to see the consensus building around a guaranteed livable income so that whatever your circumstances, you can live with dignity. We need universal long-term care. That's a huge expense. It was for my family. And we need more affordable housing. Let's get to the root causes.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Singh and Mr. Blanchet, you will both square off now. You both talk about affordable housing, but we know that affordability means different things to different people depending on where in the country they live. So when you talk about affordable housing, who are you really talking about? Per the draw, Mr. Singh, you begin. Mr. Blanchet, you may jump in anytime.
We're talking about people who are spending right now more than half their income on housing. That's not affordable. People should not be spending so much on housing that they have no money left to pay for their groceries, to pay for their bills. And the sad reality is, since 2015 to now, the average cost of housing nationally has gone up to buy a home by $300,000. So far, the housing crisis has gotten worse over the past 6 years. We want to invest in housing. We want to invest to make it easier to buy your first home and to invest to make sure there's available, affordable rental homes.
Let Mr. Blanchet respond.
Could anyone tell me how to translate logement social?
Social housing.
Social housing might be a solution to another problem. People are paying, at least in Quebec, people are paying far too much for houses because the prices have increased tremendously. The idea is to reduce the speed of that increase while helping people who cannot even afford decent lodging. If we build more social lodging, which price are obviously very lower, much lower, then it will lessen the pressure on those houses who become more and more expensive. And it will help reduce this. I wouldn't speak about an inflation crisis, but I would speak about an inflation worry, which we must have at present times. So I believe one thing might be part of the solution for the other thing when we speak about housing.
All right, Mr. Blanchet, that's time. I'm sorry, Mr. Singh, that's time. You speak about inflation, Mr. Blanchet, and that brings us to our next topic. So, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Trudeau, and Ms. Paul, you're up. Inflation is at its highest level in a decade, and it is squeezing Canadians on staples such as groceries, gas, rent. What's your message to Canadians who are struggling to make ends meet? Per the draw, you begin, Mr. O'Toole.
Well, unlike Mr. Trudeau, I will care about monetary policy because we need to keep inflation low. There is a crisis hitting families, and Mr. Trudeau seems completely oblivious to that. Bills are going up. There's a housing crisis, as we talked about, and he's making it worse with, as I said, almost $500 million of borrowing per day. There's real risks on the horizon. So we have a plan to get people work, get their bills down, give them a break. Canadians deserve a break and balance the budget over the course of the next decade. That's exactly what we need to fight against Mr. Trudeau's inflation.
Try not to
give families a break.
Anyone.
Ms. Paul.
Try not to interrupt anyone. You know, it's just an excellent question. And if you come to my neighborhood of Toronto Centre, you will see those people living in inadequate housing. You will see people paying more than half of their income just for things like childcare. And, you know, there's this expression in my culture where you talk about soon come. It's the things that you delay to tomorrow and tomorrow that should have been done today. say. This is soon come is now. We have got to learn the lessons of the pandemic and make sure that we have a social safety net in place that lets everyone live with dignity. When we invest in our people, we are investing in our future, and this is the time for us to do that. It costs us not to do it.
Over the past year and a half, I made a straightforward promise to Canadians that we would have your backs. And that's what we did. During this pandemic, we were there to support people. But at the same time, we need to continue that. That's why we've put forward a $10 a day childcare proposal that will save the average family in Toronto close to $10,000 more than Mr. O'Toole's approach on childcare, which he would cancel. We also put forward a national housing plan that will invest $4 billion to work with municipalities to create 1.4 million homes. Mr. O'Toole's plan on housing. Mr.
Trudeau, let Mr. O'Toole respond.
Sorry, let me just finish this. Mr. O'Toole's plan on housing gives $500 million on breaks to the wealthiest landlords and nothing for building new houses.
The housing crisis has gotten worse under Mr. Trudeau, and months ago he fought against us trying to take foreign non-resident money out of our housing market. We've got a plan to get rental housing built. We've got a plan to get density, 1 million new homes in the next 3 years,
with no money
and to give
on that
first-time home buyers
not a cent
a break
that,
by a
Mr.
longer
O'Toole.
mortgage. And Mr. Trudeau, Canadians are worried you're going to be taxing their primary home sale. Your advisors have said it.
Untrue.
Your candidates have said it. It's on
untrue.
page 14 of his policy book. He's introducing a new tax on the sale of homes.
Leaders, there will be more opportunity to speak about these issues. Thank you, because guess what? I'm bringing out Rosemary Barton of CBC News, and she's going to be asking you more direct questions and opening up more opportunities for debate on this theme of affordability. Hey, Rosie.
Hey, Shanti, thanks, and good to see everybody. Appreciate you being here. Let's try and get some answers this time, shall we? Ms. Paul, I'll start with you. One of the plans that you've laid out to tackle affordability is a guaranteed livable income. You mentioned it just moments ago. Give people a set amount of money to deal with their lives. There was an expert panel in British Columbia just recently that said that that is not the way forward, that actually is too complicated for the needs of our society, that the needs are too diverse. Why do you think this is still a policy worth pursuing?
Guaranteed livable income is a policy whose time has come. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic how many people were thrown immediately into financial crisis because our patchwork system simply isn't working. There is a growing consensus. The members of the Liberal Party voted for it at their convention. The members of the NDP party voted it at their convention. 50 senators signed a letter calling for it. The time has come to ensure that everyone has the support that they need to live in dignity in this country. The parliamentary budget officer looked at guaranteed livable income. He examined the model in Ontario, and here's what he said. He said that it would lift half of the people who are in poverty now out of it, that it was affordable, and that it would not disincentivize work. This is the time for a guaranteed livable income. Let's do it together.
That's time. Thank you.
Mr. O'Toole, childcare, as you know, is a huge expense for families. You would scrap the deals that the Liberals have made with provinces, which drops fees by 50% immediately and creates spaces, and eventually will reduce fees to $10. Instead, you're proposing a tax credit that would reimburse just some families $6,000 a year. So what does your plan do to create spaces and lower fees? Because as you know here, it's not just about affordability, but also about access.
It's about helping all families now, not in 5 years helping some. And our plan would help lower income families with up to 75% of the cost. Our plan will also help that nurse on shift schedules that has jobs in the evening, that needs flexibility. What we want to do is help all families get ahead and provide more support.
But if the nurse can't find a spot, Mr. O'Toole,
income.
what does she do? If the nurse can't find a spot, what does she do with her children?
This gives her as much flexibility as possible. If there's not one in her suburban community, there is no space in 5 years under Mr. Trudeau's program. We want to give families the tools to make the best decision for the position they're in now, to have ability to help them in their circumstances. Our plan will be immediate. It will help all Canadian families.
Mr. Singh, you're promising to tackle skyrocketing housing prices. One of the ways is with that 20% tax on the sale of homes to foreign buyers. 2/3 of Canadian families actually own a home already. If you're successful at cooling the housing market, that would mean that people who have invested their life savings in their homes may not have it anymore. They're relying on that for their retirement. So what is more important to you? helping younger people get access to the market, or allowing older Canadians who rely on the value of their homes to live?
It's a really fair question. And when I spoke to people, I go door to door in my riding of Burnaby, people who've got beautiful homes. I ask them, what's the number one concern? They say housing. And I kind of look around at their house and say, well, you've got a home. They say, well, I'm not worried for myself. I've got a place, but I'm worried about my kids. And they're more concerned that their kids will never be able to find a home than their own circumstances, because they're okay. They are worried about their kids. And the reality is, it is impossible for young people to even imagine buying a home, let alone renting a place that's in their budget. So we've got to get the big money out of housing. Young people, young families, professionals shouldn't have to compete.
So your answer is that it is more important for young people to get into the housing market rather than protect people who have equity in their home.
We can do both. And our plan is that everyone's telling us the number one concern they have for their kids is that they're not sure they're ever going to be able to own a home. We want to change that. It's gotten worse with Mr. Trudeau. We're going to fix it.
Thank you. Mr. Blanchet, nice to see you, sir. Seniors, as you were talking about off the top, they're really worried about the increased cost of living. You, as you said, have criticized the Liberals for increasing old age security only for those 75 and older. But statistics show time and again that older seniors are less likely to have employment income, and they actually have higher health expenses. So why should an increase in seniors go to all seniors instead of those who need it most?
First, let's say that this prime minister is supposed to be the champion who fights against all kinds of discrimination. And he did create himself two classes of elder seniors. What they want is for those between 65 and 75 to spend their private funds in the meantime.
No, but I've just given you the example about why. I've just given you the example about why the government may have done that, sir. It's because people who are 65 to 75.
Please?
May I follow up, please? That those people generally stay employed and generally have fewer health costs.
Those people have worked all their lives until 65 years old. They have paid for a pension that should be the same for everybody. And for some financial issues, the government creates two classes of seniors. It is unacceptable, and no calculation whatsoever should be so unethical.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. We are now moving to the open debate
I just have a question for Mr. Trudeau, I believe.
I'm very sorry.
If you don't mind. I don't think we should let him off the hook. I think we would all agree.
I got a little mixed up there.
Making some of our arguments on the other ones.
Well, we'll make you uncomfortable now, sir.
There we go.
You said in 2019 that Canadians should never have to make the, and these are your words, impossible choice between paying for medications or putting food on the table. We have seen you, particularly in these recent months, willing to spend billions of dollars on programs that matter to your government. Daycare would be another example of that. Why is there no money in your platform or in your most recent budget for a national pharmacare program? Is it no longer a priority? And should you not just tell Canadians that, sir?
No, it continues to be a priority because, indeed, no one should have to choose between paying for groceries and medications. On health investments, we were all focused on COVID-19 and supporting the provinces and making sure that on that we were giving the support we needed so we could have Canadians' backs. But at the same time, we worked with a number of different jurisdictions, and we've actually signed with Prince Edward Island a national universal pharmacare.
You've signed one deal, sir, but there's nothing in your platform in terms of costing. I understand the pandemic kept you busy. What about going forward? Why wouldn't you put that in place?
Going forward, we are going to continue to, but we know that it's not something we did with Prince Edward Island. We're going to continue to do with others in respect of the provincial jurisdiction that is delivery of health care. We can't impose pharmacare on a province that doesn't want it, unlike the NDP proposes. We are going to work in partnership, as we have on so many things, to get it done like we did on childcare.
Okay, and now we're going to move to open debate. Starting back with you, Rosie.
Okay, and we start here, I believe, with Mr. Blanchet.
Yeah. That's correct.
So, Mr. Blanchet, what is one policy change that you think would make the biggest difference to Canadians or Quebecers, in your case, in terms of their cost of living? The one change that you would like to see that would help them the most?
Cost of living, that's quite interesting because that's a worry that we have. We believe that the most important thing is changing the way we create wealth. We believe that transforming our own resources, natural resources, with our own clean energy in our regions of Quebec will create more wealth. This wealth will come from an environmental, I will get this word, environmental preoccupation as well. And we will do that, and we should be entitled to do that with our part of the money that is being sent again and again in oil and gas. There's one thing I want to add, even if it's not exactly, I don't know if there's time eventually.
Not really, but quickly.
I will take a few of those seconds.
Yes.
Will we have some seconds to speak about French-speaking communities and Acadians?
Well, not in this
debate?
section. This is about cost of living, sir.
And
no,
to you,
nowhere.
Mr.
It's
Singh.
nowhere. That's my problem. It's nowhere.
One of the things we know, the cost of living has gone up. The cost of medication is going up. The cost of being able to afford the medication that keeps you healthy. Mr. Trudeau, $0 in your fully costed budget means zero commitment to getting it done.
You don't have a fully costed
$0,
platform.
but you've shown your evidence with your costed budget. You've shown Canadians clearly you've got no interest in doing something that you promised to do
in your
2 years ago.
Mr. Singh.
You promised to do it 2 years ago. You committed. You campaigned on it. You included it in your throne speech, and now you've completely abandoned it. How can people trust any promise you make when there's $0 in your plan?
Okay, brief response, then Ms. Paul, then I'm coming to you, Mr. O'Toole. Briefly, Mr.
$25 billion in our fully costed platform for health, for the priorities that Canadians have told us on. Better support for seniors in care, better support for mental health services across the country, particularly for young people, and access to a primary care doctor or team. That is what $25 billion over the next 4 years gives. Mr. O'Toole's money for health is backloaded to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now.
All right, Mr. Trudeau, thank you, Ms. Paul.
I'm reminded what the question was. The question was what policy would have the biggest impact on people's cost of living.
Ms. Paul.
And I think that we have a perfect example of this again here, because the biggest thing that could make a difference in the cost of living for people is a change in the culture in Ottawa. It is so painful for me because I've had the experience of, again, having my grandparents work until they were 75 and living 600 and 800 square feet and wondering how we were going to feed ourselves some nights. I've had that experience, and I know that 1 day of delay is too much. So when I think that we could have being in Parliament now, working to get people the help that they need.
What is the policy, Ms. Paul?
These
are anecdotes. What is the policy was the question.
It's not an anecdote. The thing that we need is a change in the culture.
I hear you. I see you, Mr.
It's a change in the culture because there are several parties on this platform right now that agree on guaranteed livable income and universal pharmacare and childcare. But it's always soon come. It's always soon come.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. O'Toole, you've been waiting. I'm going to get you in.
We're doubling the Canadian workers' benefit. That amounts to a $1 per hour raise for working families. These are people working very hard, and I respect whether they get up to work a shift in a restaurant or work to open their small business. We're going to have your back. We're also going to get costs down. We're the only party with a recovery plan that includes all Canadians. And when it comes to cynicism that Mr. Trudeau talked about earlier, all of the commitments continue to be a priority. He's going to get to the calls to action. He's going to have transparency. He's going to make targets. He announces things and never delivers. Mr. Trudeau, a prime minister has to deliver on the words, not just fancy words to make promises, a plan to get there.
By the way, Mr. O'Toole, I won't take lessons from you on making promises and not following up. When we see you're beholden to the gun lobby, we're beholden to anti-vaxxers, you're beholden to a
remember,
range of
this is affordability, and Mr. Trudeau, I'm sorry, we're out of time now,
I've
sir.
been responding to people. Can I answer Rosie's question directly?
You have 5 seconds, sir.
We were able to lift 1 million people out of poverty and create
That's
1 million
not a
jobs at the same time with the right kinds of investments over the past 5 years.
And Mr.
That's
Trudeau,
what we're
I
gonna
have
continue
to,
do.
I'm sorry, sir, I have to wrap you right there because it is now time for our next theme on COVID recovery. Rosie, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, from Saskatchewan, Ethan Herman is standing by in Saskatoon. He's an undecided voter, and he wants to hear from you about COVID recovery. Hey, Ethan, go ahead.
Hey, good evening, leaders. My question is this. Coming out of this pandemic, how are you, if elected as Prime Minister, going to unify and drive Canada forward with respect to healthcare, jobs in the economy, and ensuring a higher quality of life is achievable for all Canadians, regardless of race, color, creed, or sexual orientation.
All right, leaders, you've heard from Ethan. Mr. O'Toole, you're up first.
Thank you, Mr. Herman. That is exactly why I launched Canada's Recovery Plan on the first day of the campaign. We're going to create 1 million jobs in 1 year. We're going to clean up the accountability mess in Ottawa. We're going to have national leadership on mental health. We're going to be more ready for a pandemic, and we're going to get our finances under control. I want to get people working. I want to give families a break. And since the moment I became Conservative leader, I've been reaching out, whatever your background, your faith, your color, your sexual orientation, whether you're Indigenous, whether you're a new Canadian, you're important to Canada's recovery, and you're important to the Conservative Party. And I'd ask you to look at Canada's Recovery Plan. After these 18 months as a country, we need a plan and a leader that will actually deliver.
Thank you, Ms. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Herman. And I swear I did not line up that question. He's not a ringer. But this really comes to the heart of the matter, which again is about changing the culture of politics in Ottawa. We have heard from outgoing MPs in the last Parliament how incredibly important that is, that the culture has become toxic, that has become hyper-partisan. And, you know, there used to be a time, I worked as an intern in a nonpartisan way in the Ontario legislature. You know, you would make a fuss and question period, and then you'd get to work across party lines and committees to find the solutions to help people in Canada. And so we need less partisanship. We need more diverse voices so that we can get the access to the best ideas in a more cooperative and collaborative way.
Mr. Singh.
Thank you. Mr. Herman, thank you for your question. And your question touched on a number of things. Healthcare is something very near and dear to my heart. And we've seen in this pandemic that our healthcare system simply hasn't been there. And it's not because of the pandemic. A lot of these problems were there from before. So our commitment is to invest in our healthcare system, to defend it. Unlike Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole, who believe in private long-term care delivery, we want to get out profit, get out the greed from the delivery of long-term care. We want to invest in pharmacare for all, not promise it in 2019 and then have $0 to commit towards it. We want to see everyone have access to medication. We want to include dental care into our healthcare system and mental health services. And to do all of that, we want to make sure that the billionaires start paying their fair share so we can invest in you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. Trudeau.
Ethan, I think the folks on the stage missed the very first part of your question, which is, you know, once we get out of this pandemic, and yes, we have plans for being even more ambitious on climate change and making sure people get good jobs, but we have to get out of this pandemic first. And that's why the unequivocal leadership that we've shown as a government on making sure that everyone gets vaccinated is what's going to get us through. We cannot rebuild the economy until we get through this pandemic. And unfortunately, Mr. O'Toole, who says he wants to get all of Canada vaccinated to 90% in the coming 2 months, can't even convince his own candidates to get vaccinated to 90%. We have to get through this. We are unequivocal that vaccinations are the way to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Blanchet.
I think Mr. Trudeau forgot the second part of your question, which is about healthcare. Let's be efficient. Healthcare is a jurisdiction of the provinces and Quebec. Those are the territories, the jurisdictions who should have the resources to do their job. The promises of the Conservatives is 3.5% of increase a year for the first 3 years, which is very far from what the provinces asked for. And what the provinces asked for is not even in the program of Mr. Trudeau. So it will be hard to be efficient if those who are responsible of healthcare do not have the resources which are owed to them.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Thanks, Ethan, for your question. Have a good night. We're going to let you go. It is now time, Ms. Paul and Mr. Singh, to go face-to-face, starting with Ms. Paul. And I want to talk about Canada's parallel pandemic, the opioid crisis. Since it has taken hold, more than 20,000 Canadians have died, often in the shadows. This is an insidious killer that is tearing families apart. To both of you, starting with Ms. Paul, does the political will exist to confront it?
We called many times during the last session of Parliament across party lines again for us to first recognize that this was a national health emergency and then to decriminalize simple possession because we know we need to end the stigma and create a national safe supply program. We asked every party to do it because 17 lives on average are being lost every day. We didn't hear anything from anyone. And it comes back to Mr. Herman's question about unity. Can we not unify on something like this where it's clear what we need to do? If we can't do that, then none of these other things are possible. And so that's what we have to try to do.
We definitely need to respond to this crisis with everything we have. We've long called for it to be declared a national public health emergency. And what we know is the approach that has been taken for decades simply doesn't work. The approach of arresting someone, putting them through the criminal justice system, putting them in jail does not make communities safer, and it doesn't help people. So we have been saying, and I believe very firmly, we need to provide healthcare responses to people that are dealing with addiction. We need to make sure we are doing everything we can to secure a safe supply. We need to look at the evidence and say really clearly, if there is any step we can take that'll save lives, we've got to take it.
Well, so there's a lot to do, but does the political will exist to do it?
That is exactly the question. Is there the political will?
There is,
will we
on behalf of New
there
Democrats.
doesn't seem to be because we need a national
Well,
safe
I got the
supply
will.
program. We wanted it before Parliament dissolved, and here we are, and lives will be lost in my riding of Toronto Centre probably today because of it.
All right, Ms. Paul, I have to wrap you there. It's good to hear, Mr. Singh, that it is at least coming from you. Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Blanchet, Mr. O'Toole, this round to you. Starting with Mr. Trudeau. During the pandemic, Canadians watched in horror the suffering of their most vulnerable and frail loved ones in long-term care. What if tomorrow you had to place a family member in a long-term care facility? Would you do it? Beginning with you, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. Blanchet, you may jump in.
Tomorrow is my mom's 73rd birthday, so that is certainly something we're reflecting on, but she's doing wonderfully right now. We won't have to make that decision right now. Don't worry, Mom. The reality is we've heard from seniors across this country who've been tremendously worried through this pandemic, and family members worried about that. We know that the conditions of work for the people who are in those long-term care homes are often dictating the conditions of care for seniors, which is why we propose to hire 50,000 new personal support workers working with the provinces with the money for that. Also increasing the minimum salary to $25 an hour for people who care for our elders and most vulnerable. Because
So if you had to put mom in
happens.
long-term care, you would do it?
I would make sure that, yes, that they are people who are properly well cared and that there is enough of a proportionate.
Mr.
And that's
O'Toole.
where we will work with the provinces to deliver exactly that, because we put real money
Thank you,
forward for
Mr.
that.
Trudeau. Mr. O'Toole.
This is where we need partnerships for long-term care for the CHSLD in Quebec. We're going to have a $3 billion fund that the provinces can draw on for infrastructure upgrades to long-term care. That's in addition to our record, almost $60 billion commitment over 10 years to the public healthcare system. Universal access with no conditions. We need to partner with the provinces, not create fights. And long-term care, learning from the gaps in the first part of this pandemic is something we need. And I have to address...
Would you put a loved one in long-term care
Absolutely.
tomorrow,
I have
Mr.
a
O'Toole?
grandmother in one,
All right.
and we've been in touch with her. But I have to touch on what Mr. Trudeau said about the recovery. We have to get through the pandemic first. Why did you not have that approach to the election, Mr. Trudeau? We're in the fourth wave. Everything in the recovery relates to getting out of the pandemic first. Why didn't we work
Mr. Blanchet, I'm going to let Mr. Blanchet in.
You have had 4 minutes more than I did. So now I think it's enough. The debate is almost over. Some dads and some moms don't have to worry. They will have the money, of course. Some do. And in order to give them the care they need, the care they deserve, those responsible for those cares, provinces and Quebec, should have, without conditions, because it is their responsibility, their knowledge, their expertise, the resources required. When the Army came in Quebec, they wrote a report afterward. What did they say? They did not say Quebec is not good enough to take care of its seniors. They said They lacked resources. They lacked the money.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Leaders, we are starting to get at. We're running out of time. I am sorry, Mr. Trudeau. You've had the most time tonight. I'm sorry, Mr. Trudeau. We are now moving on to our final journalist of the night. I am welcoming Evan Solomon from CTV News. He's going to be putting questions to you on COVID recovery, starting with Mr. Singh. Hey, Evan.
Hi, Shachi, and hi, leaders. Good to see all of you. Mr. Singh, I'll start with you, sir. Your pandemic recovery plan is uncosted. You have no plan to balance the books, but you promised to pay for your expensive promises, new programs like universal dental care with taxing the super rich and taxing corporations. What specifically would you do to create the 1 million jobs you're promising and make sure Canada stays competitive?
We have the only credible plan that's not going to cut help to Canadians, that's not going to put the burden back on the same people that have struggled. We're the only ones on this debate table now can say clearly we would tax the billionaires. We would make sure companies like Amazon start paying their fair share so we can invest in those new jobs, so we can invest in people. Left to Mr. Trudeau or Mr. O'Toole, they are going to put the burden back on you. They've already started. Mr. Trudeau has already started by cutting the CRE. Cutting help to people.
But what new programs, sir, specifically?
Well, I believe in making sure we invest in pharmacare, we invest in dental care, we invest in retrofitting homes and buildings. In doing this, we're going to lower the cost of living, help people save money, but also create jobs by investing in the future economy, the economy of the future.
All right, Mr. Trudeau, to you. Only 4 months ago, you released a budget that was billed as a pandemic recovery program, a plan that had $101 billion of new spending. Since then, COVID numbers are up, growth numbers are down. Now you got a new plan that adds $78 billion of new spending, essentially rendering your last budget out of date. How do Canadians trust that these new massive spending promises will not just keep growing in another few months? And what do you say to the next generation who say, how are we going to pay for this?
Well, first of all, I made a promise during this pandemic to have people's backs. Every time I came out of my house early on in the pandemic to talk directly to Canadians, I told them I'd be there for you. And that's exactly what we've done. And it wasn't just being there for people because we're nice, although of course we are. It was being there because that is the best way to ensure a strong recovery. Now, yes, our budget showed our ambition for this country, including with $10 a day childcare that Mr. O'Toole is planning on ripping up. But we also shows a responsible fiscal track. And even with our fully costed platform that is even more ambitious on the fight against climate change, on housing, on supports for people, the debt of our country as proportion of the GDP continues to decrease.
Yes or no? Is it important to have a plan to balance the budget because you don't have one? Yes or no?
It is important to stay fiscally responsible, and that's what we're doing. Our debt continues to decrease as a share of our GDP.
We got to move on.
Ms. Paul, to you now. You have not been clear if you support the need for vaccine passports or mandatory vaccines for federal workers or even mandatory vaccines for your own candidates. Given that the fourth wave is really a pandemic of the unvaccinated and threatening to overwhelm many healthcare systems, how do you justify not supporting the very measures that have proven to be most effective at increasing vaccination rates?
Evan, we just filmed a video today asking everyone to get vaccinated. We have been unequivocal in our support for vaccinations.
Mandatory vaccinations and vaccine passports.
Well, again, this is just this is again where policy gets put aside for partisan advantage, because everyone on this stage understands that everyone who can be vaccinated should be vaccinated. We need to encourage people to do it. Vaccine saves lives. And every single person on the stage has also said that, of course, there are going to be people who are not able to get vaccinated for certain reasons, and we have to reasonably accommodate them. We will always be guided by the science. We will never put partisan concerns ahead of public health.
Mr. O'Toole, you promise a $60 billion increase in healthcare transfers over the next 10 years, but according to the Independent Parliamentary Budget Officer, it's actually only a transfer of $3.6 billion for the next 5 years, which is not much different than the status quo. But you also support private-public synergies, in your words. Can you specify here tonight exactly what kinds of private healthcare innovations you want to see more of? And if a province introduces more private health care, would you enforce the Canada Health Act by holding back any of your promised funding?
I 100% support our public and universal system. I've said it's paramount. And after COVID-19, we need to rebuild it. So we have the most substantive plan to do that. 6% increase per year, stable, predictable, without conditions funding to partner with our provinces. We will respect them running and putting priorities to get wait times down, to give more choice, for universal public access. That's what we need. On top of that, Evan, we have a substantial commitment in mental health and treatment for addiction. There are going to be lingering aspects from this pandemic that we're going to do in addition.
But just,
the provinces are in charge of their system. We will respect that. Public and universal elements need to be at the core of our system, and our investments will save it and give relief to front lines like our nurses, physicians. Mr. Trudeau doesn't hire those people.
Just for time.
All right, we got to wrap you, Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. Blanchet, Quebecers relied on the federal government for life-saving vaccines and key programs like the CERB. And as you mentioned, the Canadian Armed Forces came in to save people in long-term care homes in the province of Quebec. Some believe this crisis has enforced the argument for a strong federation and undermines your fundamental argument of separatism. Given that, if the federal government, say, gives $1 billion for long-term care homes, which Quebec failed to protect, why should they not also enforce national standards?
I have still not heard from all those brilliant people all over the place and all over Canada what a Canadian can do that a Quebecer cannot do. In what way whatsoever would a Canadian norm be any better than a Quebec norm? I don't see that. And I'm not, I don't have this complex. I don't feel that I'm any lesser person than a Canadian because I'm a Quebecer.
Enforcing national standards. If you pay for something, should you be able to enforce
national norms or standards? And I would say that the Premier Legault of Quebec today said no one is to be entirely trusted in this group of people. Some are worse than others. I think they recognize themselves. But even those who are a little bit less terrible need a watchdog because they're not entitled to a majority government. So if Quebecers want, I will lead the watchdogs.
Okay. This is the open debate section. And I'll start with you, Mr. O'Toole, but everyone please jump in, not all at once. The pandemic recovery is about the future path of Canada. And all of the leaders here tonight have made promises that require historic levels of spending. But as you all know, politics is about hard choices. With some Canadians still in real need of support and other industries experiencing real labor shortages, what specific programs will stay and what will go in the next year, and who will pay for all of this? Mr. O'Toole.
That's a great question, Evan, because we didn't see the government adapt to the changing crisis. What we supported, and we all worked together, the wage subsidy, the CERB, needed to be adapted as there were labor shortages in Quebec, as we can't find enough people for restaurants and service industry. We need to target the highly impacted sectors. That's what our plan, Canada's Recovery Plan, does. We get those service, tourism, restaurants back on their feet, get people working, and with keeping cases low, we can then wind down the other programs because we need to focus on work. We have a job boost that will actually incentivize the hiring of people that have been out of work for 10 months or more.
Mr. O'Toole, let Mr. Singh in.
Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau are jumping over each other about who's going to cut help to people first. I don't agree with that approach. I don't think it makes sense to say, oh, I'm going to have people's back, but I'm going to cut as quickly as I can. I'm going to cut the help to people who need it as much as they can. We're the only party right here clearly is going to say to you, you're not going to have to pay more. We're not going to cut any programs. We're going to ask the 44.
Singh, we're giving working Canadians.
Hold on a second. We're going to ask the 44 richest billionaires pay their fair share for once.
I think
that's what we're going to do.
Respond to that because this is the second time that Mr. Singh has said we're the only party where just us. Mr. Singh, you know that that's.
Hold on, Mr. Singh.
Unless you're trying to ghost me, you know that we also okay.
Sure,
so
yes, as well. That's
okay.
Thank
you. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Trudeau, you're trying to get in.
Mr. Singh continues to pretend that it makes no difference whether there is a progressive government or a conservative, or progressive government or a conservative government. We know that it makes a huge difference to families, whether they have $10 a day childcare, whether they have a government that has their back, a government that has a plan to move beyond the Harper targets on fighting climate change. Now, Mr. Singh may feel that for the NDP, it makes no difference who forms government. I know for Canadian families,
Mr. Blanchet, you haven't been in yet. Mr. Blanchet.
Translate subvention salariale.
wage subsidy.
Wage subsidy. Did any of you three guys refund the wage subsidy that you received?
We
up
stopped
to
it
about
now.
$3 million. That would be something, at least for the principal. After that, there's an important issue, labor shortage. They are promising jobs. They should be promising workers.
Yes.
We need people to work, and that raises the question of productivity. This is the most important issue, and some programs should be turned toward that issue.
Mr. O'Toole.
In this pandemic election that Mr. Trudeau called, after everyone asked him not to, he says he doesn't worry about monetary policy and inflation. Now he's saying he doesn't ever intend to balance the budget. He's spending $424 million a day more than Canada's bringing in.
The question was, what programs will stay?
We need to wind down the support programs in a fair way and get the country working again.
We have got to remember.
Thank you. Last minute of play, leaders. Last minute of play. Ms. Paul, 5 seconds to you. I'm coming to you, Ms. Paul.
Thank you. We have got to remember the pandemic is not over, and all over this country, people still need the benefits. They should be there until the pandemic is over. And to the people of Canada, it is unfortunate we are in this election. You can see that there is a lot of work left to do. We need to get back to doing it in a more cooperative way.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Singh, I see you, Mr. Trudeau. Mr.
One of the specific programs, we demanded 22 times in Parliament for Mr. Trudeau to expand was paid sick leave. Because in this pandemic, people had to make the impossible choice going into work sick or not being able to because they couldn't pay their bills. 22 times over 18 months, we demanded an expansion, and Mr. Trudeau said no to you and said no to your family.
Last word to you on this, Mr.
Expanding
Trudeau.
sick leave to 10 days of paid sick leave for federal industries. Now, in the election, and this is important, you have seen tonight the extreme differences between the perspectives of these parties.
Leaders,
we need Canadians to make the right choice
leaders,
so we
that
can
is
move
it.
forward together.
We're out of time. Evan, thank you. Leaders, thank you for your participation tonight. That's it for the English Language Leaders Debate. Voting day is September 20th. Get your ballots. Make sure you're registered on behalf of the Leaders Debate Consortium.
Good evening. I'm Derek Fildebrandt. Welcome to a special edition of The Pipeline. Tonight we're going to be analyzing the federal leaders debate of this election we're in right now. Tonight I'm joined by Jonathan Denis, who's staring into a mysterious corner of his office. Jonathan is the former Minister of Justice and Solicitor General of Alberta. He currently has a practice in Calgary, Guardian Law. How are you doing, John?
Doing really well. How are you, Derek?
What? I don't know. I just watched that, so it could be better. We're also just joined by Jeff Calaway. Jeff Calaway is the former president of the Wild Rose Party of Alberta under both Danielle Smith and Brian Jean, and he is the president and CEO of High Ground Medica in Calgary. How you doing? Jeff, can you hear us? Okay, it seems Jeff is either on mute or cannot hear us. So our folks in technical will have to work this out.
There we go. There we go.
Oh, Jeff, how you doing?
Yep, good.
Well, gentlemen, we've had 3 French debates and one about climate change and Quebec. Quite something. I know you are all watching with me. Why don't you give us your initial thoughts? Let's start with you, Jeff.
You know, with the Green Party leader, I mean, I'm putting in this no particular order, but with the Green Party leader, it was basically a message of, can't we all just get along? With Blanchet, you know, he's obviously, this isn't his home turf that he's debating on right now, being the English language debate, but he did seem a little more calm and composed, I guess. And obviously, everything just revolves around sending more money to Quebec. And, you know, logic be damned. Let's just stop all resource development, dismiss all those, you know, foreign oil tankers running into Quebec to keep their economy going. So that was interesting. Trudeau, you know, he's a little bit combative. I do have to say he talked a little bit about the most substantive things in his government, but the problem is he's been there for 6 years, and frankly, he is just a lot of show instead of a lot of action. We're all pretty well aware of the the big promises that he makes, and then he never actually does fall through. I was glad that I didn't make a bet with you guys to and start a drinking game about every time Harper's name was mentioned, because I think we'd all be on the floor about 30 minutes into the debate. So as far as O'Toole goes, you know, he's probably he's the leader, obviously, that's on the stage that was calling for. He was the only one, frankly, that really called for any kind of spending constraint, which is speaks to affordability in this election and in the country. Because of course, if you've got government, a federal government actually pushing policies and legislation that are going to really increase the cost of living, which I thought was actually quite ironic and hypocritical to have a whole topic on affordability, and more or less all of their answers revolved around increasing more spending for everyone, because ultimately that all just hits the pocketbooks of average Canadians. We need a government that actually gets some of their spending under control. Didn't hear much detail on that tonight, but I would say that O'Toole definitely was the only one that at least hinted at that. It's always not exactly politically popular, but we are getting to a point where there's a lot of desperation in Canada. And I think the clear contrast to that is actually Singh, who his answer was just basically keep spending more money on everything over and over, and you're not spending enough. Clearly, that would be an economic disaster for Canada. If you think affordability is bad now, I mean, you'll just see the Canadian dollar decline and debts rise. And, you know, we've been through some tough times in past decades in this country dealing with overspending governments. Trudeau's father, you know, a big culprit of that. And that never ends up well. So he was probably, I would say, almost the most concerning of the speakers I heard tonight. And I will say, actually, for someone, you know, looking at there was an ECOS poll that was out today that's indicated that Bernier's PPC party is at 11% and at 19% in Alberta. And of course, well, the only thing we heard about Alberta tonight is how they want to shut down lines, and you know, Alberta is such a bad place, more or less, and we should shut down our economy. But other than that, I think he would have provided a very differentiated viewpoint relative to the other leaders that were on stage tonight. So,
okay. Well, I asked for general thoughts. I didn't need every chapter of the book there, Jeff. Thanks. Okay, Jono, I know you're watching this with anticipation. You're obviously a close political watcher. Well, give us your general thoughts. We're gonna dive into each of the leaders and some of the major happenings that took place in the debate. But why don't you give us your general thoughts about how the evening went?
So, full disclosure, I did work on Aaron O'Toole's leadership campaign, and I am a Conservative Party member and supporter. That being said, the first observation I had is I really did not like the moderator this evening. I felt she was constantly interrupting. I felt that she was quite biased. She asked some very leading questions of both the Bloc Québécois and Conservative leaders with preconceived notions, the type of thing like, well, I'm a lawyer, okay, so the type of thing in court that you could not ask your own witness. You can't ask your own witness leading questions. So I didn't really like the debate that much. The biggest issue, though, I really think that they talked about at the beginning was leadership and accountability. Okay, the big thing I take about this is that I didn't even watch Jimmy Kimmel tonight because the biggest joke was the NDP and the fact they don't know how to pay for their promises. They've never formed a federal government before, and so they can promise these pie in the sky programs with no idea how to pay for them, whatever, other than quips like, we're going to tax billionaires. Well, there's very few billionaires in this country. They got a lot of money, but at the same time, that is just a quip designed to appeal to their left-wing base of voters. I thought that the Bloc Québécois leader lost a lot of credibility when he talked about complained people about racism, but at the same time, he supports these religious restriction laws in Quebec, which don't even satisfy a charter challenge. They've got to invoke the notwithstanding clause. I would say O'Toole had the nicest tie, but I would say that O'Toole really is looking more and more like a polished leader. Trudeau was on the defensive the entire time, and he starts to speak fast, maybe as fast as I even speak. But I really felt that he feels the pressure here. He's been down on the polls the last few weeks, and he began this election. It really reminds me of a couple of governments, David Peterson syndrome in 1990. You call an early election and you end up losing. We don't have a reason for this election. All of the other party leaders brought this up because that's clearly something on the minds of the Canadian voter. Why are we going to an election? We have an international crisis in Afghanistan, and on top of that, we have a COVID pandemic here. There was no need for this election.
Yeah, I got to pick up on that point there, Jonathan. There was, I felt, not a lot of real substance in this debate tonight. We talk about affordability, but just the nature of the debate, everyone ends up giving a few talking points, and there's not a lot of real substantive. The questioners, I give them credit for trying to nail them down on some specific topics, but they all are used to, well, there's a saying about question period in Ottawa. There's a reason why it's called question period, not answer period. So they're
not
actually
just in Ottawa.
They're all very well practiced at avoiding, anything substantive and being pinned down. But one of the things that I mean, honestly, is a little bit near and dear to my heart that I think a lot of Canadians have really noticed over the past few weeks is just that tragedy in Afghanistan and what we see is unfolding with the Taliban coming back into power there. Canada and Western Canadians, Albertans, wherever you are on the spectrum or however you feel about Canada, I think we do honestly share some real common values about who we are as a country, our history, how we are a country that a number of peoples who have come here to create better lives. We share with each other willingly. We want the best for people. We are a beacon of hope. We've got a proud peacekeeping history as a nation, and yet we've got a government in this Trudeau government that had fair warning from our intelligence services and from partners around the world, and yet it was this government, Trudeau, who is still technically prime minister right now, who have the ability and the authority to save like literally hundreds of people's lives. Canadians, people who were wanting to emigrate from Afghanistan, people who have helped our Canadian forces and volunteers and contractors over in Afghanistan to help them create a better life as a democratic country and to provide opportunity for women and to provide education for people. And it's absolutely morally abhorrent that we have abandoned the people in Afghanistan that were, standing in sewage ditches, trying to cling to landing gears on airplanes, trying to flee just what is an absolute tragedy. I mean, we saw today that, Afghanistan, the Taliban, they appointed a central banker whose profile picture has them holding a big, huge a weapon with no actually formal understanding. That country's going to, well, apparently it's a surprise to everyone except Trudeau what's going to be happening in that country. But the point being that points to the values of our leadership, what this election and what the priorities of this prime minister that we do have right now are all about. And that needs to be held accountable. So, even if you're not, if you look at exclude everything else, what do we actually want in our leaders, no matter where you are in Canada right now? That is, as much as anything else, something that we as Canadians should think about as we go to the polls on September 20th.
Okay. So let's, I don't want to make this all about the moderator, but let's just talk about that real quick and get that out of the way. I know Jono had some comments. She did seem to be particularly partisan, at least in the sense that she had a very strong ideological point of view. The preambles of her questions, she essentially accused Erin O'Toole of being a homophobic climate change conspiracy theorist, or that he was harboring them. Those are her words. So she certainly did seem to have.
If I could jump in on that.
Well, hold on. I'm actually going to come back to you in a second, John, because you're the one who started the moderator. But where I did think she was good, I actually didn't mind her interruptions for the most part. She was, I think, really good at keeping them on time and on topic, because you've got 5 leaders up there. They're talking over each other already quite a bit as it is. And it is hurting cats. It's a pretty thankless job being the moderator of a debate like that where the stakes are so high. I think she did a pretty good job of keeping order, keeping them on topic. I think it was just, her ideology obviously came through. It's difficult for it to not come through. But also just the debate commission, the way it selected these questions was ridiculous. These kind of broad themes where we talked only about a couple of things all night. We talked about climate change for roughly a third or a quarter of this. Obviously, First Nations reconciliation, I think, absolutely deserves some time. Maybe not a quarter, because there's a lot of topics to get to. I mean, there wasn't a section reserved for Afghanistan. I think there was some popular outcry. They got at least a question slipped into there under one of those topics. But there wasn't any section dedicated to balancing the budget, taxes, finances, the West. None of this. So I think
there was
pretty poor in that sense.
Finances. It was just about spending more money. That was the answer.
Yeah. Well, there was no questions, or there was at least no segment about balancing the budget or a segment about finances. Evan Sullivan at the end got in a tiny little question, which Trudeau did not answer, about balancing the budget, and everybody took that for granted because there obviously is no plan. It'll balance itself. But I don't know. I think being a moderator of a debate like that is tough. I'm pretty unforgiving of it. But her ideology aside, I think she did a pretty good job in a tough position there. But I think Jono might disagree with me. Oh, is Jono gone?
Well, you know what? I'll just pick up on what you were saying there, Derek, about, one of her questions was, given 25% of Canadians are skeptical about climate change, how do you propose we get to unanimity? And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, no matter what you're thinking here, apparently the moderator thinks we've got to get to 100% groupthink on a particular topic. I mean, it's kind of a similar thing regarding vaccinations. I'm very pro vaccination myself, but I also believe it should be a personal choice. But this is why we live in a free country where people can make these choices, and that's got to be respected. I think that we are seeing, in all of the commentary that we're hearing from the leaders tonight, bigger programs, more spending, more controls, more all across the board. And I think actually the APTN questioner was kind of interested in her comments about holding Trudeau to account on providing resources for First Nations and the reserves. How, there's been more spending. There's two big new departments to deal with First Nations, but and trying to help the First Nations, but none of it actually gets down to the reserve. It just results in more bureaucracy, more programs.
So,
and Trudeau even.
So I want to run through. So I want to run through the different leaders on the stage here. Actually, maybe we will start first. You had mentioned this. Well, we'll start before we go through the leaders. Let's start with the leader who was not there, Maxime Bernier, leader of the People's Party of Canada, not invited by the federal government's debate commission. They had a certain set of criteria about how to get in that he did not meet, apparently, at first. He had to have an average of 4% in the polls to qualify to get in, and apparently he was just below that when they were doing their polling average. But he has since then far, far exceeded the polling requirements to get in. ECOS today had him at 11. Main Street, I think, has got him around 9. Either way, he is the very clear fourth party right now, well ahead of the Greens. Oh, Corey Morgan has decided to pop out of his hole. Okay, well, we're going to go to Corey in a second here, but we're going to go through each of the leaders. But right now we're going through Maxime Bernier, who was not invited. He's now well ahead of the polls that are required for him to get in fourth place. As I said, ECOS, having him at 11, has him right on the tail of the NDP, which is at 15. I mean, just another 4 points and he'd be tied for third. I think it was a shame that he was not there. Even if you don't like what he has to say, at least it would have added some variety and some. It was such a polarized and loud debate for 5 leaders who seemed to more or less agree on all of the big questions. The only debate seemed to be on some rather marginal differences, disagreements on the margins about how to implement some of these big ideas, which they all agree with. I think it would have really added some spice if we had Bernier on the stage. Unfortunately, he wasn't. But let's go to Corey. Just your thoughts on Bernier's exclusion from the debate and what it might have meant for him to have been involved.
Well, it would have brought a unique perspective in. I mean, I think most of what this debate ended up coming out about was how the leaders were presenting themselves. I didn't see much new in policy or approaches. It was all pretty predictable out of them. We heard everything we'd expect to hear from them. Bernier would have brought in, one voice for smaller government, one voice unapologetically speaking against restrictions and lockdowns, whether people agree with it or not, because there was no real debate on any of that. And it was a loss not to have that voice, whether one agrees with it or not. I mean, Annamie Paul did what she could, but realistically, she's not representing much. It's a party in shambles, and that spot would have been better held by Bernier.
Well, I would tend to agree with Corey there because I have a really difficult time the fact that they allowed the Green Party, which they should, but then again, they exclude Bernier. I'm not a Bernier supporter. So why did they exclude him? He's running a full slate of candidates just like the Green Party.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to go through each of the leaders who were at the debate. I've got fairly extensive notes on everyone except for Trudeau. I mean, I just found that very little of Trudeau stuck out. The main note I've got for him on my in my notepad here is that he was asked about why we're having an election right now when all of the parties in the House of Commons are supporting him. He has no question about holding the confidence of the House of Commons. He can continue to govern for a full 4 years, stick to the fixed election date, which is established by law. He was asked why, and he just could not answer that question. That's actually the biggest question he has to answer. That's the question every leader every premier, every prime minister that calls an early election needs to be able to answer on the very first day of the election. Why are we having an election? And if that answer is not a good and compelling answer, at least enough to make people forget about it, they get into trouble. And in my experience, and John, you were in that election too, Jim Prentice tried to frame a question about why we're having an early election in Alberta. At least he had an answer, and it was certainly a lot more compelling than Justin Trudeau's. But it was still not a good answer, and he paid a big price for that because people were still talking about this early election come debate day. And we're on debate day now, and we're still talking about having an early election. Justin Trudeau was not able to answer that. But otherwise, he seemed defensive, angry, both defensive and offensive, but flailing around, trying to land a punch because he's behind in polls. Under the current vote, he probably, quite possibly, still continues as prime minister of a minority government. But I'd like to go to each of your thoughts about how Justin Trudeau, in particular, performed in the debate. Let's go to Jeff.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was a little bit feisty. He's got a lot to answer for. He's got a lot of words and show. As Singh pointed out, that he likes to voice. He says a lot of things. He performs a lot. But at the end of the day, just like what that APTN interviewer stated, you're spending a bunch of money. The bureaucracy is growing like crazy. So maybe that's his job creation program, is more bureaucrats. But besides that, there's little to show on the ground. And when you want to talk about affordability, he repeated over a few times about, I've got your back. Well, I think a lot of Canadians feel like that's a knife in their back when they start looking at their utility bills and looking at what the cost of food is in their homes. And, I think that some of the leaders really could have gone after him more forcefully than that. I mean, there was the question from the senior on about affordability and for seniors, and it was basically just an answer of, we've got a variety, a grab bag of more money to give to seniors. I think really when you're a senior and you're talking about affordability, it really is things like your food bill, your utility bill, the cost of gas, and a lot of those issues and those affordability issues are caused by the very government, and are caused by the Trudeau who's standing up there trying to speak about affordability and saying he's got your back. No, he doesn't.
Okay. John, do you think like Trudeau's? I wouldn't say Trudeau's behind. He is technically behind 1 or 2, maximum 3 points, depending on which poll you look at. Although his vote is probably more efficient because it's not hyper concentrated like the Conservative Party vote, at least was in the West. So even if he was to get elected, even with a minority, without the most seats in a minority, he might still continue as prime minister. But either way, he is behind, and his visions of when the majority government was a twinkle in his eye when he called this election, that seems to be gone. Do you think he did what he had to do to try and make up that ground, consolidate the NDP's vote, that kind of progressive leftist vote behind him, and try to punch down the Conservatives a bit?
No, I really don't, actually. He was on the defensive the entire evening. He seemed very, very flustered, very, very irritated. 2015, the Liberals ran a quackerjack campaign. None of us here voted for them, but they ran a great campaign. They even elected 2 seats in Calgary for the first time in 40 years. 2019, it was okay. This time, their campaign is in the toilet. They're chasing their tail the entire time. It reminds me of a government that I was a part of when many of us, including me, told the leader not to call an early election. And then I drove down from Edmonton. I knocked on the doors of all of the supporters, and they said, "Why are you calling an early election?" You're chasing your tail the entire time. It's also very interesting, though, that Trudeau himself has lamented, I might call another election in 18 months. Well, why are we doing this? There's no purpose for this election. The interesting time, though, I just want to address one other comment that you had made, Derek. If in past elections, Conservatives had to be at least 5 points up because the vote is so consolidated, Alberta, Saskatchewan, bit of Manitoba, Eastern BC. This time, though, O'Toole's numbers are actually down a bit in Alberta. We can talk about that later. But they're up a bit in Ontario. The other thing is that I've always believed that Conservatives have a higher voter turnout. They have some of the best data, the best voting machine, the best get out the vote programs. And I do think that Conservative supporters are a little bit more motivated. Governments aren't elected. They are unelected. And in this particular instance, the people that want Trudeau gone are going to be more motivated to vote than the people that want him to stay for a third term.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn towards Conservative leader Erin O'Toole. In the absence of having Bernier on stage, he got to look the Conservative a bit. But Justin Trudeau kept on repeating, I can't emphasize how big the differences are between us. You need to make the right choice. These parties are so different. And Erin O'Toole's strategy seems very deliberately to be the polar opposite of that, trying to minimize the differences that, you can have essentially more or less the same government, but you can have a more competent and less corrupt and less narcissistic person leading it, trying to really play down those differences. The first question that went to Erin O'Toole from the moderator, which I specifically pointed out, essentially said, you've got all these crackerjacks in your party, homophobes and people who are climate conspiracists, climate theory conspiracist, her terms. Who is driving the bus? And is it you or the caucus? And Erin O'Toole said very plainly, I'm driving the bus, saying, forget those guys. They're essentially an electoral college. And he's not incorrect. That's the way the system works right now. The MPs, the caucus have remarkably little power in our system of government right now. So he wasn't lying when he said that, but he was going to pains to say he is the Conservative Party now. He's saying, I am the new leader of the new Conservative Party, trying to put a different coat of paint on things. He went to pains to talk about his, I'll use his terms, climate pricing, saying, I am going to put a price on climate change, etc. He did not call it a carbon tax. He has never called his carbon tax a carbon tax. He didn't call it here, probably aware that calling it that is probably a bridge too far for supporters, with his right flank already under significant fire from Bernier and the PPC. What I really wanted to see, and we'll talk a little bit about Blanchet in a bit, he had one really great moment, and Blanchet promised he would do this in the French debate. In the French debate, apparently, because I don't speak it, O'Toole apparently said that there should be no pipelines through Quebec, and he apparently said that in French. taken translations at their word for it here. And that night, during the French debate, Blanchet said, "Are you going to say that same sentence in English?" And tonight, Blanchet had quite a moment, and he said, in the French debate, you said there should be no pipelines in Quebec. Will you repeat it right now in English? O'Toole did not reply. He just kind of smiled, played with the button on his jacket, and that was that. The moderators let him go because it wasn't his turn to speak anyway, but he probably could have intervened if he wanted to. That was a very interesting moment for me. And Blanchet was playing, again, I don't want to make this too much about Blanchet, but that stood out as a very weak point, probably the weakest point for O'Toole in the debate. That's kind of my summation, but why don't we go back to you, Jeff, about how you thought O'Toole did this evening?
Yeah, I didn't see any big moments. In fact, actually, if I actually had, I think the biggest moment of the debate was probably that Merrick fellow, the 18-year-old kid who was asking about reconciliation. So it's never a good thing when you've got a regular 18-year-old kid citizen who, at least in my mind, had the high point in the debate and held the leaders to account. But I will just kind of go back to more of an overall political strategy type of perspective for O'Toole. It's clearly they're running a different kind of a campaign versus the Scheer campaign a couple of years ago. Scheer, they were running up the score in lots of constituencies or ridings where they were, great. You went from 75% to 80% or 60% to 70%. It doesn't matter. You're going to win. But you got to go and win a bunch of those tough ridings in Ontario. So they've taken away all of the objections that have typically been thrown at the Conservative Party. I'll say these are politicians that we're talking about. So sometimes their promises aren't always followed through. I think that there is going to be, I am confident that the Conservative Party would definitely be much better than this liberal government on a number of fronts as a government. That being said, I think it's also very clear we're going to be in a minority government. But
absolutely.
But at least you would get a much better government than what we're faced with today. So on items like kind of the flip-flop that we saw from O'Toole, or if you want to call it a clarification, but it probably more like a flip-flop on the gun issue, basically accepting Trudeau's position. Call it a levy, a fee, or a tax. It's a tax is a tax is a tax at the end of the day, and it is a type of carbon tax that he's basically backing. So he's taken away a lot of that ammunition from his opponents, particularly the Liberals. And so I see the strategic value of that. Take away the opposition, square the election, focus it on Trudeau, and that people are getting tired of Trudeau as the leader. They're getting tired of the empty words. And so, and people are maybe looking for a bit of a change. This could be a bit of has the opportunity to at least be a bit of a change election, and that's really what in my view, what the Conservative Party platform is about. I mean, I'll get on my hobby horse. I think they should be nailing Trudeau and this Liberal government on the values of Canadians and how they walked away from that, at least as shown very bluntly in Canada's actions or lack of action in Afghanistan. But anyways,
okay. We'll try to keep it tighter here because we want to get through everything before we go on too long. Quickly, Jonathan, how do you think O'Toole came out tonight? Do you think he achieved what he needed to achieve?
The biggest thing O'Toole needs to achieve is he needs to show stability and confidence. I think he did both of those things very well. He came across as a very polished debater. His cadence, his confidence, and just his air were all better than Trudeau's. And that is what he had to do. People know who Justin Trudeau is. People don't know Aaron O'Toole that well. So he has to do that much better in the debate. And while there was no knockout punch, the only one in a Canadian prime ministerial debate I can recall is in 1984 when Mulroney knocked Turner out totally knocked him out. There wasn't a knockout punch, but I think O'Toole needed to do what he was doing to solidify the vote that he had and perhaps expand it further. Either way here, though, we're in a minority government situation. We're going to be having these discussions in 18 to 24 months again.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say one thing too. We've seen just a little bit of decrease in the momentum of the Conservative Party here, I think, in the last handful of days, and it seems to be somewhat related to the gun issue being brought up. I'm not actually commenting on the flip-flop or otherwise. It just seems to be come up, and so I have to say I was actually a little surprised that it wasn't brought up more against O'Toole tonight. So I think that actually worked in O'Toole's favor, and I'd agree with Jonathan that he put in a composed, polished performance. He's a very accomplished individual himself. He's very smart. He's very disciplined. And, that's, I think, a great credit to him as a leader and potentially the next prime minister of this country. So.
Okay. All right. So, as I said, we're going to try and keep it quick here so we can get through in relatively timely fashion. Blanchette seemed to give a don't give an F vibe the entire debate. He obviously has the lowest stakes. I don't think many unilingual Anglophones were changing their vote tonight about if they're going to vote for the Bloc Québécois or not. So this is really just he's kind of playing to the home crowd in this sense. It's almost like an away game. This is like Calgary playing in Montreal. You get to show off what you're doing away. And so in that sense, he was very antagonistic towards English Canada, very, talked about, he said the Bloc would put a cap on Western energy production. I hadn't actually heard that before. I don't know if that was a policy that he's had yet or not, but it was absolutely flabbergasting for a leader that claims to represent Quebec, which takes an incredible amount of wealth from Western Canadians on a daily basis to fund its operations, would say so, but not altogether surprising from what we know. He had a great line. He says, "I'm not that interested in running Canada, but let me tell you why I should be at this debate anyway." It was kind of a funny line, but I thought he made actually a fairly compelling argument about why, at least from the perspective of a Quebec nationalist, why the Bloc Québécois should hold the balance of power. He says, some of these parties are bad, some of them are slightly less bad, and the characters know who they are on the stage here, but none of them deserve a majority. They need a watchdog, and it will be an advantageous position for the Bloc Québécois to hold the balance of power and be the watchdog on the big parties forming government and parliament. And I thought that was actually a pretty salient argument about why the Bloc Québécois, from the perspective of a Quebecer, is actually a very good option, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on. But what really stood out with Blanchette for me was how every question was about Quebec. We had this entire segment about First Nations reconciliation, and essentially his answer to them all was, yes, First Nations have been mistreated, but who else has been mistreated? The Quebec nation. Yes, First Nations didn't sign treaties giving up their sovereignty. And who else didn't sign a treaty giving up their sovereignty? The Quebec nation. Everything was about him. Everything was about Quebec. And it got almost sad comical at a time. It's almost funny if it wasn't such a serious topic. But I'll go to Jonathan about...
Sorry, Jonathan, I'm going to jump.
Okay, we'll go to Jeff.
Yeah.
Jeff is raring to go. Jeff's chomping at the bit, so you go, Jeff.
Yeah. Just regarding Blanchette, I actually thought one of his best answers tonight was when Rosie Barton was trying to catch him on the seniors funding. And, he kind of started to give an answer, and she kind of like doubled down on her question. And, he kind of paused a little bit and thought, no, I thought there was a bit of a touch of emotion there. And he talked about how these people that have been working their entire lives, why shouldn't they also get the benefit of that? I guess the nature of the question was, why should you give all seniors money instead of only, say, those who actually need it themselves? And, his point was like, these people have worked hard and contributed and they need it. So I actually thought that was pretty interesting. But, just to kind of pick up on how you talked about putting a cap on Western energy production, he's clearly over and over and over always answers in whatever is in Quebec's best interest, and he'll take money from anywhere and anyone across Canada to do it, and it's never enough. Just more and more and more. But at the same time, and Quebec rights expect respect our nation, respect our province, everyone else butt out. But you know what? You can't produce energy, and I'm going to be totally on board in supporting whoever is, if it's a Liberal or God help us, an NDP government. Stop the economy from growing in Western Canada. That's just quite fine by him to support. So it's quite a bit of hypocrisy there on his part. And also, let's just be frank, double down here. He's got a couple of refineries in Quebec that they seem quite fine, taking oil in from Saudi Arabia. So anyway, but I will say the only other comment I'd have is, I don't know if you guys might remember, there was a movie back in the early 90s with Kevin Kline that was called Dave, and it's about a guy, the actual president dies, and then they find this community job finder guy, job search guy. They bring him in and install him as president because he's got a remarkable resemblance to the actual president. And he actually turns into be this nice kind of relatable guy that comes in and acts as president. And I sort of had almost a little bit of that feeling tonight. But again, that's when you don't really have much on the table. You get to be a little more just natural and less caring. So.
Yeah. Okay, Jonathan, do you, Yves Blanchette, has he got your vote? You gonna back the bloc?
Well, first off, I live in Alberta, so I have no option to vote for the Bloc. But I will just offer this comment. Who could argue that the Bloc Québécois has not been successful in their mandate over the last almost 30 years since Bouchard broke through with 52 seats in the 93 election, formed the official opposition? They've been very, very effective in turning the agenda to Quebec and raising the specter of Quebec separatism. And as a result, we see where all the transfer payments go. So I'll give Blanchette some credit. He's breathed new life into it. He did quite well in the 2019 election. I will give him also credit that his English has improved, and his English is sure a heck of a lot better than my French is. But the blatant hypocrisy, he starts talking about, we want to put caps on the oil sands. Listen, the amount of oil that is being imported from politically unstable jurisdictions, transported across the world, when we have a politically stable supply of energy in Western Canada with high environmental standards, high social standards, again, in the same country. Why are you opposed to these pipelines? And instead, you're incurring more fossil fuels, more emissions to bring the energy from across the world. It makes no sense.
Okay. So we're going to go to discuss Jagmeet Singh, and there was some other lady on the stage. I think she was the independent candidate for Toronto Centre or something. She was going on about the environment or something. I'm not really sure who she was. I think she had one of those Seinfeld puffy pirate shirts on, but I couldn't quite tell. Jagmeet Singh, I think, if he's your cup of tea, I think he comported himself well. The man knows how to wear a suit. I think his answer to everything was spend. I think he got it was unremarkable. I don't think he's going to really break through too well, but I don't think he made any big mistakes. I think he more or less held his ground fairly well, and certainly stood out more than that lady from Toronto running for MP somewhere.
Yeah.
Let's go to Jeff.
Sure. Just regarding Anne-Marie Paul, just briefly, really, other than a little bit on the environment, her only answer was, let's all just work together. We just need to work together.
Rainbows and unicorns.
Yeah, it was totally. She's going to lose her seat. Elizabeth May might keep hers, but this election's going to be a big downdraft for the Green Party. That's just the bottom line there. But besides that, on to Singh. Now, Singh, obviously his answer is just spend more money on everything across the board. You can't have there's not a government program or a program you can invent that you couldn't spend more money on. And of course, for Canadians across the board, it doesn't matter your economic situation in life. Everyone's going to get hit at the end of the day. So that it's just completely unfeasible. But the other thing that really struck me through the debate is he has a nice way about him in communicating, and a bit of a smile. And coming from the old Wild Rose days, Danielle Smith used to be very good at this too. She could deliver tough news or a tough line or a tough bit of love, but as she said, if you just do it with a smile on your face, people think it's kind of okay. And Singh kind of has that ability to do something very similar on that front. But when you actually listen to his words, and if you took away the voice and the picture and you read his words, he really acknowledges and I think stokes a lot of fear and anxiety for people in society. And I think that is actually ultimately kind of a bit of a dangerous quality, something I was just picking up on. I mean, you ask him a question and he's empathetic and he acknowledges, and then he accentuates whatever the thing that's driving that fear or that anxiety of someone, and that it acknowledges it rather than and doubles down on it. And I think it was just very apparent to me that it's something that contributes to the division in society rather than, let's sit down and have approaching something more of a, let's sit down and deal with the issue. It's accentuating those fearful feelings. And so that I hadn't ever really, I don't honestly listen to Singh very often, admittedly, but that was something that really kind of struck me tonight. So take away the picture and the smile, and you think about the transcript, and you can see that the politics of fear, anxiety, and division really kind of coming out in his words, actually.
Jonathan, do you think that Jagmeet Singh made up any ground tonight, or how do you think he comported himself?
So I really watched Jagmeet Singh, and listen, there is nothing you can do to make me vote NDP, okay? But I'm going to say something nice about him. He has really improved as a leader. He articulates his image, his point. He speaks to his base. He's well learned. He's a smart guy. Okay. He obviously had a good background in the Ontario legislature as an MPP. The thing with the problem he has is that Trudeau has gone so far to the left. How does he define himself as different from Trudeau when he has been propping up the government on numerous occasions? The Liberal Party today is much different from the Liberal Party of the 1990s. Sure, under Chrétien and Martin, you got some annoying things like billion-dollar gun boondoggles that no one on this podcast would support. But at the same time, you also got balanced budgets. You got tax cuts. They reduced capital gains tax. They championed our energy sector. They brought in an international free trade agreement. I don't see any of this type under Trudeau. It is a very, very different Liberal Party. Much like his father, he has reached as far to the left as he can, alienated Western Canada. The question is, how does Jagmeet Singh define himself when Trudeau has been eating his leftist lunch the last few years?
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. It's already been a long evening. This broadcast is, God knows how long it's gone on. It's been going on since the leaders' debate started. I want to thank you both, Jonathan Denis and Jeff Calaway, for joining me this evening. And all of you who have been watching, some of you have stayed with us, some of you have not. But it's been a long, long broadcast. I want to thank you all for joining us. If you're not yet a member of the Western Standard, go to westernstandardonline.com and click on membership. You can try it free for 15 days. See if you'll like it. If not, well, then I'm sad. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.